So we went from 30 to 60 million bison in the, probably late 1700s, early 1800s, to by 1886, they counted 500 plains bison, which are essentially from central Alberta and south all the way to Mexico. There was only 500 left. And then wood bison, which occur from central Alberta up to Alaska. And there were also only 500 left of those.
Guys, it is my distinct honor and privilege to introduce today Dennis Jorgensen, Bison Program Manager of the Northern Great Plains from World Wildlife Fund. Dennis, welcome into the show. How are you doing today? I am so excited to talk all things bison with you.
Yeah, I'm doing great actually, and I'm really excited to be here. And I'll just let you know, even though I work on bison these days, I tracked rattlesnakes for 2 years, looking at their migrations in Alberta. I'm originally from Canada. If no one's detected it yet, it'll come out when I say out or about or something like that. Yeah, I worked with rattlesnakes. I've looked at migrations of long-billed curlews in the Great Plains, worked with mountain lions, pronghorn. I was a generalist before I started specializing with bison. So yeah.
Would you, before, I guess then, I'm so sorry, before we get to the bison, I'm just like
Yeah.
taken by like all these other animals. Could you
Yeah.
go into just a little bit why and how does one track rattlesnake? And like, because again,
Yes.
that's going to be a common
Yeah.
theme, I think, between all these interviews of like why we do these kinds of things, right? In order, like,
Absolutely.
just a broad ecosystem question, like why, and
Yeah.
then yeah, how? Because your image actually on
Yeah.
WWF's website is you're holding a snake.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's prairie rattlesnake in southern Alberta, southeastern Alberta, which is the northern extent of the plains. Um, so I guess taking one step further back, and I will answer your question. When I was a kid, I was interested in all things, all living things. So tadpoles, frogs, garter snakes, bees, and I think, I often think that there's like two types of biologists, and maybe that's not fair to say, but there's the ones that are like fascinated by living things and like just catching them and looking at them and watching them and stuff like that. And then I think there's the people that actually want to dissect them and classify them and all that. And I was the former. Um, and so when I had a chance in my work in environmental consulting to work on a project where rattlesnakes were falling into pipeline ditches in Alberta, and I was working for the oil and gas company that was putting in a pipeline. And so it was my job to make sure that no rattlesnakes were getting buried alive in these pipeline ditches. But then also to make sure no one got bitten and to kind of do the safety briefings and all of that stuff for all of the workers in the area. And that was when I learned that for some reason, these rattlesnakes and their migrations were resulting in them kind of being hardwired to move in a particular way. And, I think that that's where maybe you and I might have some kinship. Like when you really study animal behavior and movement and things like that, you start to realize that there's some things that are inevitable. And what I learned about the prairie rattlesnake migrations is that they live in these dens along river valleys in Alberta, where you get a situation where there's huge dens, right? And that has to do with both mammals burrowing and slumping soil that creates big fissures in the earth that allows them to get below the frost line. Because way up, I'm not that far from there. I'm about 8 hours south of there, but up in Canada, in order to survive the winter, they have to get below the frost line, so probably below 6 feet under the earth. And so you get these huge aggregations of rattlesnakes, sometimes hundreds, and in a few cases, maybe even over 1,000 rattlesnakes in one den. And so when you start thinking about that many animals concentrated in one place, and you think about the food that would be available for them when they emerge in the spring, then a fixed bearing migration, like spokes on a wheel away from that central den, makes perfect sense in terms of competition, right? You get as far from all of the other snakes as you can. The further you go, and the more less likely you are to encounter competition with other snakes, right? But at the same time, when you're migrating on that fixed bearing, you might actually be encountering other snakes that are migrating away from another den on the river valley. So what we were seeing was like a lot of cool things, but we were seeing that rattlesnakes were migrating long distances, and I believe that they are still amongst some of the longest migrations of terrestrial snake species in the world. I saw round trips of over 30 miles in 5 months. Um, and that's out and back, so they do come back to the same den again. But the cool thing is that they mate at the furthest extent of their migration, where they encounter other rattlesnakes from other dens, so there's outbreeding. But the other thing that does, though, is it creates huge risk for those rattlesnakes when they're crossing landscapes where there is agriculture, where there are highways and roads, where there are cities that have sprung up around where historically their dens were. And what I saw, and I think that this is kind of a common theme across wildlife, is that you actually have resident and migrant morphs of a species. That happens in like salmon and a number of other species. And so what's happening is that there is strong selection pressure against migrants and for residents. But if you think about, if you're a resident snake coming out of a den with lots of other snakes, and you're now moving within a small fixed area around your den, you're much less likely to find food. You're much less likely to deal with heterogeneity, so like good years and bad years. Whereas when you migrate on a long fixed bearing, you're going to hit patchy habitat. And in hitting all of those different types of patches, you're more likely to encounter something that might be good. But at the same time, crossing roads and everything, you're encountering much greater risk of mortality, right? So there's trade-offs. But what I was seeing was that those animals that migrate always tended to find more food. And I was tracking females, and for females, it's really important to get fat. It's really important so that you can become pregnant, and to be pregnant more often if you find lots of food. And the females that were now resident snakes, and I don't think that it's optional, I think it's genetically coded and you're just getting selection for one or the other. But those resident snakes were having good years and bad years, and that means that some years they're forfeiting an opportunity to become pregnant because they're not gaining weight. And so I think consequently also you're getting smaller populations than you had historically, because the carrying capacity of an area surrounding the den where the area is this big versus with migrants, an area this big where you can search for food across all of that area means that you necessarily have kind of a lower carrying capacity of the environment for these rattlesnakes. And I was tracking them at 2 different sites, and we saw that at one site that was essentially native prairie, there was about 80% migrants and 20% resident snakes, which I think is sort of the historic state, the natural state, or closer to. And then there was an area that was high in agriculture, had a highway that was transecting the habitat. And there we saw only 20% migrants and 80% residents. We looked for genetic kind of signature, and we didn't find anything. But at the time we were doing like 8 microsatellites or something like that. So it was kind of old school.
I do wonder, like, what's the genetic basis for the migratory behavior versus staying static, right? Like, is it something that's like heritable in terms of epigenetics? So it's actually a gene that's changing activity, or is it a physical change to the DNA? And it's interesting, either way, right, that you're seeing these shifts in terms of accessibility to the migration site.
Yeah, and I don't think that I'll ever have the opportunity to test it, but I think it was a fascinating system because I think you're actually getting reproductive isolation between the 2 morphs within a single den. So if you think about the migrants that they're going out and mating with other migrants way out on the prairie, up on the uplands, and then the residents, because they stay close to the den, they necessarily mate with other residents, but they're all occupying the same den over winter. It's just that's not their mating period. So it's a really fascinating system, and I wish in a way that I could, encourage someone to keep studying it. And what I would say is that I saw in good years and bad years that females that I tracked repeatedly didn't change strategies. So it appeared fixed. And of course, I only studied them for a few years. But that said, I suspect it's a fixed trait. And then you're just getting selection against it. And I calculated the probability of being killed on a road with the amount of traffic and the speed at which vehicles were traveling and all of that stuff. and it was about a 90% risk of mortality on a road. And if you think about it, rattlesnakes, when they're threatened, they also stop and they get ready to strike. So it just increases the probability that they're going to stay on the road longer, get hit. And a lot of people, unfortunately, intentionally run over snakes in that area because they think, okay, yeah, I just took out a rattlesnake. And I actually saw a semi fully loaded with 1-ton bales of hay that almost went into the ditch just to hit a snake. And I think they thought it was a rattlesnake, and it turned out to be a bull snake. But I had a intern with me from Germany, and we witnessed the whole thing. And unfortunately, you know, it was basically you're watching a snake just explode, right? Because it's getting run over by this semi. And to think that someone almost put their truck in a ditch just to run over a snake because they thought they were doing the right thing, you know, it was a little bit sad to see.
I guess we can shift it to a educational moment, right? What
Yeah,
is like, and this is again a very naive 1,000-foot view kind of question,
yeah,
but what is the benefit of having the rattlesnakes, you know,
yeah.
traversing, staying in a given area and just having them exist? Like what would happen if we didn't have them? Why is it important to be conserving this kind of animal independent of just respecting nature, right? Like why
Sure.
should you
Yeah.
not run off into a ditch chasing this guy?
Right. You know, I mean, I can't say I'm necessarily an expert on that front, but you know, I would say probably, you know, a lot of people who live in the prairie find that rodents get into everything, you know, into their homes, into, you know, might be grain sheds or whatever. And again, rodents have their own role, but I would say, you know, they are an important predator in the system. And I've handled about 1,000 rattlesnakes, never been bitten. Um, I actually one time wanted to just watch two rattlesnakes where they were courting, and it was so amazing. They ended up on my feet. Literally, like at first they were a little ways away. I just stood still. I knew that they were more intent on each other than they were on me. You know, like you know that they were kind of yeah, just checking each other out. You know, but it was really cool because both just appreciating them as something that isn't a threat unless they're threatened was amazing, but also just to see how they behave. And, you know, it's really cool. So let's see if I can do this. Okay, so imagine that that is the length of a snake's body, and that's the female. The male was then flicking his tongue and tapping his chin along the length of her body. And I assume that that was trying to both gauge her interest and to maybe get her a little bit hot and bothered. And they did end up mating as well. So I guess he did it right. But
Uh, It's such a it's a wild image too to think about just how you've outlined their biology. Because what I never thought of, right, is that they are in a den, right? You said
Mhm.
like thousands potentially together, and that's not the
Yeah,
mating time. It makes sense from the evolutionary perspective that you're not going to want inbreeding, that you want to get
right.
go away to get feed, but it's like they're all
Yeah.
there,
Yes.
right? And so it's
Right.
like
I know that that is the fascinating part. And also that varies. So there are massive dens of red-sided garter snakes in Manitoba. I don't know if you've ever heard of a mention of those. You should look it up. You know, and they merge from like limestone formations, I think, under the earth, um, and they do breed at the site of the den. So it you know it seems that it's variable, but in the rattlesnakes, it's typically away from the den.
it's so cool. Another night. I'm so sorry, Dennis. All the naive
No, not at
questions
all.
coming at you.
Let's talk about all kinds of things. Yeah.
How does one track them? Like how, because you
Yes.
mentioned like you
Right.
could get repeat customers, if you will, and
Yes.
like tracking the same females. Is it like a little
Yeah.
sensor? Are there
Right.
marks or barcode? How do you do that?
Yeah. You know, so it was a somewhat invasive approach to tracking them at the time. It was like 2004, 2005 when I was tracking the rattlesnakes. So, you know, GPS technology wasn't where it's at now. Um, and so I was using radio transmitters, and that meant having the big antenna where you're listening for beeps and all of that. But you know, essentially the radio transmitters at that time were about the size of a small mouse, and they were implanted in the body cavity of the rattlesnake. and that was through a surgery. So, but that said, I was studying them because what we were seeing was that there was a huge number of dead rattlesnakes on the roads, and we wanted to understand what's going on. And there had been some studies in Wyoming. There had been an unpublished study in Alberta as well. And we kind of knew that there was this mechanism of fixed bearing migrations. We didn't know whether a road potentially stops any rattlesnakes in terms of them being hesitant to cross, and whether all rattlesnakes were migrating. So we wanted to understand that better. So I tracked, I believe it was 28 females on their migrations over a couple of years, as well as doing pit tagging so that you could identify individuals in the population and so on, and look at who's coming back to the dens and everything. Yeah, so I guess if you want to hear a bit of a story,
Please,
I'll give you just a
it's so
sense.
cool to hear
Yeah,
these behind the scenes stories. Like
yeah,
our community has been blowing up in excitement just because you don't get to hear these kinds of things. So like from you, the expert, like
yeah,
please, if you have the stories and you don't mind staying on with us,
yeah, sure.
please tell us.
Okay, cool. So, it's I don't know if it's a parallel to fish or not, but the way that you catch a rattlesnake so that you can implant these radio transmitters is if you put up like a wire mesh fence at the den. When a snake hits a wire mesh fence, they will turn left or right. They'll follow the fence to try and find a way out. Then we had these box traps where, much like a fish net, where you have like a funnel, it's a funnel trap essentially. And when the snake crawls through the funnel into the box, they then move back to the light, but that's on the outside of the funnel rather than at the center of the funnel. And generally, they can't find their way back out. And so in the spring, when they're emerging from the den, I would set up these wire mesh fences around the den. I would put out the box traps with the funnels, and I'd catch as many rattlesnakes as I could. And I was looking for females in particular, just so that we could say something more specific about their migrations and everything. And learned also that there are natal den sites. So when females are pregnant, they go a short distance from the den to areas where there are large rocks that provide secure cover. And then they can sun themselves during the day because they actually have live birth. They're what's called ovoviviparous. And what that means is that the egg is in their body, but when they give birth, it's essentially the offspring are emerging from that egg as she gives birth. So she doesn't lay eggs. She lays out in the sun, allowing them to develop, draws on her fat stores, potentially loses 30 to 50% of her weight during that time, and then gives birth to them. And so they would emerge April, May, and then she lies there with other females. They tend to be communal, not necessarily, but they can be. And then she'll give birth in August or September. And you can imagine if she's lost 30 to 50% of her mass, she's really wanting to go find food. So she will leave the young. She'll stay with them for a short time. Then she'll leave the young there. I believe that maybe via scent trails, pheromones or something, those young find their way back to the den site, which is within hundreds of meters. And she'll go off and try and find food. But the amazing thing is that there's times where a female will go 18 months without a meal while she's pregnant if she doesn't find food when she goes searching after she's given birth, because she then goes back into the den for another 6 months after that. And she's already been through one winter where she was pregnant in the den, the summer where she's laying out and basking, and then back into the den. So, there is a chance that they die in the den over that second winter if they don't find food. But yeah, so catching rattlesnakes in these boxes. There was actually one time where I was carrying one of those funnel trap boxes. I was in a sandy, like kind of a sandhills badlands environment. And, there's cactus everywhere, sagebrush, short mixed grass prairie. And I'm walking on the sand and I tell myself, oh crap, you know what, this is really slippery. I might fall. And I don't know, I sort of think of it as like, I don't know if you ever heard this before, but when you're skiing, don't look at the trees, look where you want to go. Um, and I told myself I was going to fall, and I did fall. And there was like 20 rattlesnakes in this box, and I sat right in a patch of cactus. I didn't put my hands down to catch myself because I didn't want to drop the rattlesnakes. And yeah, I had hundreds of spines in my butt. Um, Humbled myself, dropped the drawers, and pulled all of these spines out. Set the box down and everything, and they were fine. And then I had a 3-hour drive back to the city because I was going to be bringing.
Sitting in the car. Yeah.
Yes, and you know what? I actually propped myself up on the back of my seat and really pushed into the back of that seat so that I wasn't resting too much on my butt. Um, but yeah, I had to be at the zoo the next morning. And so I had a 3-hour drive back to the city. I got home really late that night. And my partner at the time, I went and woke her up and I said, "Do you mind holding the front door for me while I carry something in?" And so I carried in this box of 20 rattlesnakes in like a terrarium. Now I had transferred them, and they stayed on our dining room table for the night before I took them to the zoo the next morning to have the radio transmitters implanted. So that was kind of a fun thing. And my partner, like, she was half awake when I asked her to hold the door, and as I was walking in, she could hear a little bit of rattling. And it's interesting. I don't know if you've experienced this. I don't know if it's the case working with ants or not, but I do find that, like, once you get to know an animal you're studying, you kind of learn how to move around them, and the ways in which it alarms them or it doesn't. And I think it's also almost like a Zen thing, or getting to a certain state of mind. But I did find that over that time working with rattlesnakes, that I was able to move in such a way that it generally didn't set them off. And it's a kind of about slow, fluid movements. And yeah, so that was kind of one thing that I thought was neat. I do feel like I have like a closeness to rattlesnakes in a sense.
And that's
Yeah.
also why, like you were saying, when people were asking, like, "Oh, how many times you got bitten?" You're like, "Well, I haven't." And it's because
Yes.
presumably you've built up that knowledge of how to move around them, and that's what shows that,
Yeah.
you have been working with them a long time and you understand this because, like, no, I'm not getting injured.
Yeah.
Like, I don't have a
Yeah.
gnarly story because I'm like paying
Right.
attention to these signals.
Yeah, and I think it's about respect to some degree too. And I'm not going to fault anyone who does things differently. But there's people who milk rattlesnakes. There's people that hold them by the head. And I had learned from another rattlesnake researcher when I was just beginning, and she always used tubes. And so you just put their head into a transparent tube that is slightly larger than the diameter of their head and neck. And then essentially they just can't turn around in that tube. And that way you're not really manhandling them. And, it can actually affect their feeding response when you're holding them by the head and things like that. So, I think it was about respect to some degree too, in the way that I handled them, and minimizing handling. But, it was very invasive to implant those radio transmitters. But that said, we were trying to understand what can you do to reduce road kills and that impact on the population. Unfortunately, what I learned is that, like I said, they radiate out like spokes on a wheel from that den away from the river valley. And so you can't really put up any sort of structure along the roads because they can cross at so many different points, that it really wasn't feasible. But it was good to understand that there is a response in the population. It's not necessarily a positive response, but that they do tend to become resident in response to high traffic in agriculture.
For their mating behavior, you mentioned that there's the possibility of being pregnant during this winter, like over
Yeah,
season. So does
right.
that mean, like, is the usual life cycle that I'm going to try to get in the ideal situation, right? Get as
Yeah,
far away from the original nest as I can,
yeah,
mate to have that genetic diversity, come
yeah,
back to the original nest, and
yeah.
then the next season go out and actually bear offspring?
Yes, yeah, yeah, that's right. And so they have delayed fertilization. And so I can't say I know for certain, but I believe that they store the sperm. Then they become pregnant, and I believe there's also multiple paternity as well. Um, And so yeah, as of the spring, you can essentially say they are pregnant, and that they are then just basking to support the development of their offspring in their body over that time. And
It's
they are so cute when they're born. They're about the length of a pencil, if that. And yeah, really beautiful, their patterns and everything. And at that point, I don't even know what they consume, like, because they are so small. I never saw them feeding or anything like that, or did any research on that. But yeah,
it's really cool to think about, like you said, the multiple paternity too,
yeah,
the storage of sperm. Like there must be then some
yeah,
internal sperm competition as well to select for the
right,
best output. Yeah, it's such a really really cool
yeah,
like biological phenomena of how these animals work.
yeah. Do
Yeah,
you do you ever
they,
talk about, like, I don't know a ton about your audience and how young your audience is at the lower end, but to me, the thing that I love when I hear about science, and I've done science fairs, led science fairs for my daughter and things like that, and I reached out to one of my science heroes from when I was a kid, someone that I used to see on television who would talk about paleontology, and he actually led the conservation program for the Calgary Zoo for many, many years. And like, he was someone who made me believe that I could become a scientist, right? And that there was a field to aim for. And I think I'm going to sound really old saying this, but I think that sometimes we do a disservice to young people when they don't understand that there is a job for every interest out there. And I'd say the same in the science field, that yes, I know that it depends on science funding and the availability of grants and academia and opportunities within academia and so on, and getting into your program. But like, I really encourage young people both to understand all of the jobs that are out there in the world, but also all the research that's going on out there. And that if you reach out to scientists like myself or you or others in the field that you see as potentially some of your heroes or people that you want to emulate, or that you just want to understand better, I think many of us would respond and will respond if a young person reaches out to us and says, how did you arrive where you did? What steps did you take? What programs did you do? Where did you volunteer? I did a lot of internships. And sometimes those are tough because there can be a lot of competition even. So I remember one opportunity where a PhD was applying for an internship when it was really an undergraduate opportunity. But yeah, I just think sometimes we do young people a disservice when they don't realize that if you're interested in something, there's likely a way that you can pursue it. And so I would just encourage young people to really, hunt. Yeah, and especially these days with AI and the way Google functions, you could probably literally ask, who is studying the fleas on a worm's back, if that's what you're looking for, and find them, and then yeah, write someone and see what happens, and I'd say that with any field and any hero you might have, give it a try, or get your parents to help you give that a try.
no, I really appreciate you mentioning that because we have ages, I think five is probably some of our lower
Yeah,
end, and then we've got folks who are, senior citizens who are like, and so we spread the whole
yeah,
gambit. And it's that love of biology of like covering, we're SciAnts, but it's not just ants, it's all kinds of
yeah.
biological phenomena. And there's been definitely, we've heard like, oh, my kid got interested in this thing now because of the show, or like didn't know this was an
Awesome.
opportunity. And the worst case scenario, right? Is there's always apps out there like iNaturalist allowing you to
Yeah,
do some observational citizen science, like pretty reliable now, like with the AI tech too, of like seeing
yeah,
where the species are in terms of the edge of their ecosystems. Like there's a lot of cool
yeah.
stuff that we can do.
Oh, for sure. And that actually reminds me. So I know you had my colleague Clay Bolt on recently, and an amazing naturalist who has such awesome curiosity about the natural world. And I've had the privilege of traveling with him to look for bumblebees in Alaska. And it reminded me of why I became a biologist when I was speaking earlier about, like, I just used to love to go outdoors and see what I could see what I could find. And I think with iNaturalist and apps like Seek as well, where it actually helps you potentially identify species, you can do a little bit of a um, Easter egg hunt, of sorts with your kids and get them out there and say, okay, yeah, let's go identify a few things today. Or, like when I was with Clay and we were looking for particular bumblebees, say, okay, yeah, what type of habitat does this species occupy? Let's go searching today and see if we find it where we think we're supposed to. And that could be flowering plants, which are in, at least where I am in Bozeman, Montana, in the spring, you can get your kids out and go looking for flowers. But I think that element of searching for something is something that sometimes we say these days it's hard to get your kids out. Well, try something creative.
It's almost gamifying the learning, right?
Yeah, yeah, and some people might say that it's unfortunate, but I think at a certain point you can translate that interest into putting the phone away and just going out and searching for things and exploring. Some people talk about land snorkeling. I don't know if you've heard that term before, but essentially, like we value opportunities like going to a reef, a coral reef, and looking at all the life that's there, but and kind of just moving through it and seeing what you see. But I think so often people just follow the beaten path and follow a trail. And of course, there's certain places like Yellowstone where you're required to stay on the trail in certain places because there's risk. Um, but I think that getting kids out and essentially land snorkeling and exploring your environment and seeing what you see, from the mosses to the trees and the insects and all of that, um, yeah, I think you can get past the gamification at a certain point, and not every kid's going to take an interest, but some will.
I know my 3-year-old likes to follow ants back to their homes, and then we talk about that
Cool.
that's their house, and
Yeah.
and so it's like it almost becomes like the family unit of the ants. And the other day we found termites outside, and that was really cool
Yeah.
because they look and they're shaped different with the different casts. And she
Yeah.
was just like pointing at them, and we put them into a little beaker, and I'm like, a 3-year-old enjoying these bugs. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny because I had this thought when my daughter was little. We went, I believe it was maybe in Minnesota, where we saw fireflies. And I don't know if that's the right common name necessarily, but that said, it got me thinking about like a theme for a children's book. So if there's any people out there that are writers and wanna steal this idea, go for it. But I was thinking about the fact that, she had such fascination for fireflies and how they emit that light. But it made me think about living things and the inherent energy that each living thing has, and that um, I mean, it'd make for a fascinating book to first talk about fireflies, but then to share that sort of message that everything has energy, and it may not manifest itself in terms of light and something that is a spectacle in that sense, but that there's a spectacle in every element of nature if you're willing to like watch and be patient and to just recognize that inherent value in things, and so I just thought that it'd be cool to start out with the fireflies, but then to expand to just, give a sense of inherent value.
I love that. Yeah, and you're right. It's the fireflies are really eye-catching. And like for little
Yeah,
kids, just like the idea of chasing them outside, right? Because there's this
yeah,
glow to it, and there's just something magical about it when
yeah,
you see it in real life happening.
yeah.
Um, Speaking of magical, Dennis, because
Yes.
I don't want to, I know, I presumably imagine you have eventually a heart out, right? In terms of how long you can stay
Sure.
on.
Yeah, it is the weekend, but I also don't want to either bore anyone or just dominate the conversation.
Oh
So
no,
yeah.
if you're willing to stay on for 6 hours, we'll go for 6 hours.
Okay, cool.
That's not an issue. I just want to be respectful of you
Cool.
and your time.
Yeah, of course. Yeah,
Um,
no, that's great. Thank you.
I just want to make sure too that we hit up the other animals as well that we wanted to
Yeah,
chat about. And then again, as long as you're willing to stay on, my
yeah.
friend, we can have an 8-hour show of just you.
Okay.
That is totally fine if you are okay with it. Um, I did want to get kind of touch on how you made the transition from snakes to
Mm,
bison, And
Yeah.
then a question that we had, earlier on is, what is a bison, right? How is that different from a buffalo? And
Yes.
then where in the world do you find bison? Or is it just where it's just in that one Great Plain area and those delineations? So again, like a little bit
Sure.
career trajectory because snakes are a
Yeah,
little bit different from bison. And then what
for
the
sure.
heck even is a bison?
Yeah, yeah. So I guess I would say that um, I don't necessarily consider myself an expert on bison in the sense of being a researcher and scientist in that space. But when you work in a certain system like the Northern Great Plains or the Great Plains, you start to get a pretty good sense of the system as a whole and kind of the essential pieces. Um, and I would also say that at a certain point at World Wildlife Fund, we were really working across that suite of species. So like I said, I'd worked on pronghorn and mountain lions and grassland birds, including long-billed curlews. Um, and at a certain point, we were like, okay, what are those like flagship species that we really need to be working on to ensure that keeping grasslands intact? There are certain species that are both more controversial and that will not come back just on their own. There needs to be active reintroduction. And so I believe you spoke with my colleague Noel Guernsey the other day, and we're probably speaking about prairie dogs and black-footed ferrets. Without active restoration, you don't get the black-footed ferrets back in the system, a key predator of the prairie dog. And the prairie dog system itself, as Noel shared, I think it provides shelter and food for 160 other species, something like that.
The vegetation too, just like the
Yes,
soil,
exactly.
like
Yes.
it's crazy what, and she was telling us they went from 5 billion with a B prairie dogs
Yes.
to 2% of that now, and it's
Yes.
still like it's there enough where it's still able to maintain this ecosystem. But again, like she was mentioning, intervention for the plague that we introduced as
Right.
people, hunters, right? Without that, you would collapse this entire ecosystem.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think to think about those small predators that were in the system too, like swift fox and the raptors and all that would have supported. I feel like in a way the prairie has suffered death by 1,000 cuts um, as you gradually took, like imagine when you had prairie dogs everywhere, that was bite-sized meat everywhere. And I don't know if Noel referenced this sometimes, and it's not meant with any disrespect, but they call the prairie dogs the chicken nuggets of the prairie, right? Because almost anything that wants to eat them can eat them. Now, imagine going from the billions to, 2% of that, and suddenly meat isn't everywhere. And that actually happened after the bison were nearly exterminated. So we went from 30 to 60 million bison in the, probably late 1700s, early 1800s, to by 1886, they counted 500 plains bison, which are essentially from central Alberta and south all the way to Mexico. There was only 500 left. And then wood bison, which occur from central Alberta up to Alaska. Um, and there were also only 500 left of those. So from 30 to 60 million down to 1,000 animals. And it did actually get worse. They counted them in 1886. The extermination of the bison was published by William Temple Hornaday in 1889. He reported this. He had actually had trouble finding the last bison on the prairies so that he could taxidermy them and put them in the Smithsonian for understanding, viewing, and so on. But you think about like he was contacting everyone asking where can I find bison to collect and taxidermy, and he was having trouble finding anyone who could tell him. And finally, just south of the Missouri River in north central Montana, someone told him, "Oh yeah, there's some here." And he went out there, and I believe he saw about 30, and he collected 18, like killed 18 and then had some of those taxidermy. But the interesting thing is that he also sounded the alarm. So in 1905, the American Bison Society was established. And from 1905 to 1935, they increased the population from somewhere in that neighborhood of hundreds to about 20,000 animals across parks and wildlife refuges in the country. And Theodore Roosevelt was part of establishing the American Bison Society as well. So that was sort of the first wave of bison restoration. And I should mention that Indigenous people also played a really important role in that, gathering up some of the orphaned calves across the prairies. So one herd was established on the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes in Montana. There were others established in the Dakotas as well as in Texas. So it was a joint effort between ranchers, Indigenous people, and the governments in Canada as well. There was a herd, actually, the one that was on the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, where Theodore Roosevelt tried to secure an appropriation from Congress to buy that herd, and they said no. So then that herd was sold to Canada, the Canadian government, and they proceeded to try and load them onto train cars between 1905 and 1912. Or 1907 and 1912, and they actually had to create these reinforced train cars because literally the bison were being funneled up into these train cars and busting them into like splinters. And so it took 5 years to round up. I think initially they were sold 300 bison, but the population grew to somewhere around 600, and they were shipped up to Canada. And there's kind of a cool story about them coming back to Montana more recently in a transfer to establish a new population. So kind of full circle. But I'd say there's kind of a renaissance in bison restoration that's happening now with Indigenous people, with conservation organizations like ours, with ranchers, the Ted Turners of the world and others who are trying to restore them at scale. Let's see. Yeah, so how I came to bison, it really was that matter of, okay, which are the species that need active restoration to come back? And in sort of that intervening period of bison restoration, generally the biggest problem was that 75% of the herds had less than 400 animals. And I believe it was about a third of them that had less than 50 animals in what they call conservation herds, so those that were managed as wild as possible. And so geneticists suggest that herds of at least 1,000 bison were really critical for the long-term genetic health of the species. And so we've really been working with partners like tribes and national parks to try and, if we can, exceed herds of 1,000 animals. That's not to say that herds have to be, because it really depends on the carrying capacity of the environment. But the thing, and for your viewers, the thing to understand is that, the dominant land use today is livestock grazing. And so you really do actually have to create places where you can restore bison. And when we're talking about these herds of, it doesn't have to be 1,000 animals, but you're talking about tens of thousands to over 100,000 acres to restore a herd of 1,000 bison. And so tribes are some of those communities that really embrace the return of bison. And so we worked with them significantly. And they really have been under-resourced in their efforts to bring bison back. And so we're trying to bring resources to those efforts, because that's what makes it more possible. And they have the vision. We can bring resources and some technical expertise and support, and partners, trusted partners who can help in those efforts.
What's the different, I guess, how many different bison species do you know, like on Earth? Like, are there
Yes.
ones like ranging outside of North America? And then do you know of like the key difference between like a buffalo versus a bison?
Yes.
Like what makes our bison unique here?
Yeah. So I can tell you that. So I mentioned wood bison, which are a subspecies in the north, northern Alberta or central Alberta, north up into Alaska. And there are some traits that you can see that are fairly visible. They have more even hair across their entire body. The plains bison tends to have what you call kind of chaps, so it means that their hair is more towards the front of their body, more heavily haired, probably related to dealing with cold and heat to a greater extent in the plains and all the way to Mexico. Also, the positioning of their hump, the wood bison tends to have a hump that's more towards the front of their body, in front of their front legs, versus the plains bison a little bit further back. And also the wood bison can get slightly larger. So a big bull can be 2,500 pounds versus a plains bison. They can exceed 2,000 pounds, but usually don't get up to 2,500. And then there is a European bison, which would be the closest relative to our plains and wood bison. But then otherwise, what we refer to as buffalo are typically water buffalo, Cape buffalo in Africa and Asia. But what I think really happened early on was that I believe it stemmed from a French term for bison. And so because a lot of the early, fur traders and explorers were French, they began referring to bison as buffalo. And then what I see today is that typically our tribal partners and rural people tend to refer to them as buffalo. So it's kind of colloquial. Whereas scientists and urbanites tend to refer to them as bison. So I would just say that, I don't correct my indigenous and ranching partners because I know what they're referring to. But a true buffalo is a water buffalo, Cape buffalo, and they are from Africa and Asia.
Nice. So there is this scientific delineation, but the colloquial context clues on what you're talking about will let you know what it is. It's a really cool because that's how I've heard it too. Of like, oh, it's the North American buffalo, right? That's been like the colloquial presentation for it. And it's nice to know. No, it's like they're very distinct animals, distinct kind of populations that you're dealing with.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You mentioned restoration, tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of acres, right, to handle one of these like 1,000+ herd of animals. What goes into restoring land, like to making sure that it's ready for the buffalo? Because I imagine that it's not just some flowers, right? What like I can't even begin to process what goes into that. So can you walk us through like, here, Dennis, here's 100,000 acres. What do you do?
Sure. Yeah, I would say to some degree, every project has its commonalities and every project has its differences. Often when a site is identified, it may be a matter in the tribal context. The way World Wildlife Fund often supports these projects is by helping to lease the land in the first place. So on reservations, because livestock grazing is the dominant use, then there is still a competition for these leases. But when they become available and a tribal partner identifies themselves, often the tribal government will have a bison herd or wants to have a bison herd. And so we'll work with them. But other times it could be a native-led organization. And we look at their internal capacity and kind of what the opportunity is, the vision that they're outlining. And I will just say that is kind of the foundation, that there is a driver, or there are drivers in the community, that there's a desire to see bison restored to a certain area. And then we can start looking at what is the health of the land currently. And we tend to contract with some experts who will go out and look at what is the composition of the land. They can get a sense of how heavily it's been grazed in the past. Sometimes there is a legacy of overgrazing on lands. And so it's not typical that we do any sort of reseeding or anything unless we are starting at a point where it has been cropland. And if it's been cropland, then we can reseed with native grasses and forbs at the beginning. And within a matter of a few years, you could potentially restore bison to those lands for grazing. That hasn't happened too much. We just did a large reseeding on Fort Belknap Reservation in north central Montana of, I believe it was about 3,100 acres. And the grass is taking really well. And so we imagine that you will get that fenced. And that's another thing that might not be what people imagine, is that it does require fencing. Cattle fencing can hold bison, but it all depends on whether you provide all the resources that they need within the fence. They are incredibly powerful animals, incredibly athletic. So if they wanted to get at something outside of the fence, they could jump a 6-foot fence. and you think about I'm about 6'1", so yeah, jump over my head. And I have actually seen in like a handling facility when a bison was in the chutes and really wasn't happy to be there, that it jumped high enough that it probably could have slam dunked a basketball, and it weighed like 2,000 pounds, right? And I've also seen them, snap wooden poles before that are as thick as like a, not I wouldn't say quite a telephone pole, but not far off, um, just by running into it. So, just in every way, they are like supreme athletes. And so you aren't trying to build a Fort Knox, right? And what we have today is what we call wildlife friendly bison fence. And that means that the bottom wire is a smooth wire that's strung at a height that's high enough for animals like pronghorn and deer to go under the fence. And typically the fence is also has a smooth wire on the top in case some wildlife like elk, deer are jumping over. Pronghorn are generally built for speed and not for jumping, so they tend to go under. And if you have a standard fence, like historically, it can prevent migrations of species like pronghorn. They'll encounter the fence and they'll either camp out where they would typically cross, or they'll move back and forth. And we have seen mass mortality of pronghorn where they just froze to death in a really severe winter, because they couldn't move through. So that wildlife friendly aspect is important for ungulates. But you do also need a fence that you anticipate will likely hold bison. So we work with the tribes to decide what is that fence going to look like exactly. We have certain specs that we've drawn from a variety of sources. There's guides out there from state fish and game agencies, from other, like the Turners, Ted Turners of the world, who have a number of bison herds on what lasts. And so, it's an assessment of what is the carrying capacity of the land, what is the current state of the land, where do we want to put the fences? Do we want it to be just one perimeter fence on tens of thousands of acres, or will there be any internal fencing? It's interesting with cattle, often they want to rotate them, and that is actually in some ways meant to mimic bison on a landscape, because bison tend to graze and move, and so you get very patchy grazing. And it's really fascinating to see, the studies that have been coming out recently, one from the Nature Conservancy, who's had a ranch that has both bison and cattle, where they've also used prescribed fire, and that was in the Conza Prairie in Kansas. And they found that after 30 years, native plant species diversity had increased by about 100% under bison grazing, about 50% under cattle grazing. So both had improved the grassland over time with good management. And that was relative to patches that they had left ungrazed, like what they call exclosures. And so we're seeing something similar in some of those sites where we've restored bison with tribes, and in a very short amount of time and annual monitoring. We monitored one site in the Sandhills. It's the northern extent of the Nebraska Sandhills, but it just juts up into South Dakota on the Rosebud Reservation. And we worked there with Sichaguko, the economic arm of the Rosebud Sioux tribe. They wanted to restore bison. And that's one of the projects that I think, when you ask, how do you do this? It was really cool to work with them, because we started right from the beginning, like, okay, there's a piece of land, 27,680 acres. We really want to acquire this. We really want to restore bison to this place. Can you help us? And so we initially did kind of a rapid feasibility assessment with the experts we work with on range. They took a look at it. They came back to us and said, yeah, the existing carry capacity estimates look like they're in the right ballpark, and this is sort of the feasibility of it. And I think in today's world, unfortunately, you do have to look at that sort of sustainability piece. Like, can you both provide for a community? And this is the thing about bison that I think I'd love for your viewers to understand, is that they are revered by tribes, and that relates to a relationship that goes all the way back to their creation stories, but also to their survival And that, not every tribe wants to necessarily have, sort of sales involved in restoring their herds, but many do consider that, because you still have to figure out, how am I going to pay for this to sustain it in perpetuity? And so there is a market for bison. They do also harvest bison. And the thing about bison is that they thrive. So today, because the dominant land use is cattle, you are generally going to be restoring bison behind a fence. So in the case of what they called the Wool Lakota Buffalo Range, which is what I was referring to, they knew that they could have probably somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 bison on those acres. But once you get to that number, which happens quite quickly, a bison herd will double every 4 years, with a certain structure, certain number of females in the population. And generally in a natural state, it's 60% females, 40% males. And so you actually do have to have a plan for either how you're going to transfer bison out to other sites when they reach that carrying capacity of the land, or how you are going to consume that many or sell a portion of those, whether that has to do with hunts or selling them to other tribes, or selling them to a market of some sort. And so it's very nuanced. It isn't pure conservation in the sense of what people might think of. Okay, let's put some bison out there and let them multiply, and they will fill that landscape, and then they'll fill the next, and so on and so on. Unfortunately, maybe in some senses, there are those constraints on how we restore bison. But that said, my belief is that if we can develop a model of sustainability for restoring bison, particularly with tribes and large land-based tribes in the Northern Great Plains, whose reservations are sometimes on the order of 670,000 acres to 2.7 million acres. And that is larger than Yellowstone. And if you can find a model of sustainability, bison and bison proponents are not trying to take over the world, but at the same time, like when you restore them to 20 or 30,000 acres and you figure out how to generate some economy around that, how to feed your people, how to know that your children are receiving nourishment that their ancestors could digest, that made them strong, that made them healthy. One thing that I find really fascinating is that when they look at archaeological remains of Plains people before European arrival, they were among the tallest people in the world. So they were healthy and they were strong, and that was on a buffalo economy, and I'm sure there was huge trade networks amongst tribes. They've found that before, that, you find different types of flint and oral history tells of, these trade networks across the country, to the coasts where there was fish, and, to the plains where there was bison, and where there were certain berries, and, I'm like oversimplifying, but, tobacco and I mean, just everything that you can imagine. And so traditional foods can make these communities strong again. And currently they are underserved, they are undernourished. Access to grocery stores is limited, and food programs are essential. And I think, restoring bison is part of making Plains people and Buffalo people, which is what we refer to many of those tribes that had that close relationship with buffalo. They refer to themselves as Buffalo people. Maybe one other really fascinating thing. So I've learned a little bit of the Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota language, and just very little. But they refer to every species as a people or a nation. And so when they talk about the plants, they say the root nation, or and the buffalo nation, or the buffalo people. And I think that it's a shame that maybe our language doesn't reflect that, because if we viewed every being as another people or nation, we would see equivalency. And so I just love that aspect of the Dakota and Nakota language.
It's a great deal of respect built into the language of other people, right,
Yeah,
to other organisms versus just between humans. That's really,
right.
really cool because it also tells you that there's going to be this inherent value to that life, right? If you're already talking about it with that much respect.
Yeah, yeah. So anyway, I know that I go in a lot of different directions, but yeah. So essentially, what I would say is that we get the fence in place. We talk to the federal government will often donate bison from national parks and refuges where there are already bison herds because they are also dealing with the constraint of limited landscape size. At a certain point, the bison reach their carrying capacity, and so there's a program to donate bison via a group called the Intertribal Buffalo Council, who then goes and transports the bison from those sites to tribes. Um, and generally that's a nation to nation relationship. That's a government to government where it's between the tribal government and the federal government. If it is a native led organization that's restoring bison, then we have to look at World Wildlife Fund potentially helping with funding to purchase bison. And that can be from other conservation sites. American Prairie has donated bison in the past. There's the potential for the Southern Plains Land Trust to also potentially donate bison to native-led organizations who don't have access to that government-to-government relationship and those sources of bison. But at Woolakota Buffalo Range, there was actually about 11 different sources of bison ultimately, and the Nature Conservancy also donated bison to that project. So really, really diverse genetics in that herd. And in a matter of 4 years, working together, we established a herd of about 1,000 bison. And through ongoing ecological monitoring, we actually saw that the number of native species in just a matter of 4 years, native plant species, pardon me, doubled. At least those detected at permanent monitoring sites. And so I suspect that those seeds are already in the seed bank, but something about bison grazing gives them the opportunity to grow differently than if it's being grazed by cattle. And I want to just be sure people understand too. It's not that we think that bison are a magical creature. It's just a matter of you have two different dominant grazers, and they have different behaviors. Bison tend to roam much further from water. They tend to graze on the move, not kind of camping out as much near water. And I think their hoof action as well, they say it tends to aerate the soil more, get those seeds embedded and things like that. But whatever the case, we are seeing that same phenomena that they saw in a 30-year study at Konza Prairie, but seeing it in short order. And so it's pretty amazing. And I do think, in my work and my career, I feel like, there are amazing scientists like yourself who will tell us what the impact is, and we may collect the data and everything, but happy to have other people work with that data. And we do have great scientists at WWF as well, but my role is to create the places. And just knowing that bison can have a unique impact when you give them the opportunity at the scale of tens to 100,000 plus acres, I know that that's what I want to do and keep doing, and especially with tribal communities that want to see the bison back, because there are lots of efforts out there where they're trying to restore bison in places where it's more controversial, and there's some of those people are my colleagues, and they're doing good work, but that's the work of decades of trying to make something happen. And as I mentioned, this Woolakota Buffalo Range, in 4 years there were 1,000 bison on the ground. We were helping to pay for retaining that land, pay for staffing, all new infrastructure in place, a very diverse bison herd, and starting to support local food programs and food sovereignty efforts. So, I think the amazing thing about bison, and I think the reason that they were revered, was because they were central to their life and their culture. And even though they can't necessarily be all the things that they once were, and not everyone has the same view in those communities. Not everyone is traditional, and not everyone has that traditional relationship with them. They can still generate an economy on tribal lands. They can generate food, and that like food and revenue retention in tribal communities is still a rare thing because of systems that were imposed over 100 years. And so I think it contributes to the overall sovereignty of the tribe in the long run, that they can sustain themselves, and start to restore species that they revere, that they take pride in, that they are connected to, that they believe is their relative, and in their creation story that they are one and the same. The bison just emerged from the earth before they did. So yeah.
Given that backstory for the native peoples, is it easier to get community buy-in from them versus ranchers? I would imagine that's a little bit easier. Can you talk to us a little bit about the difference in approaches that you have to take? Because given
Yeah.
how big the land is, right, that you're trying to
Yeah.
take for the bison to be successful, I imagine there's difficulties in wrangling just the buy-in of both groups of people. Can we just talk
Right.
about a little bit of the differences of what you
Yeah.
have to employ to get folks on side?
Absolutely. And I do think that I don't want to speak for Indigenous people, but I've worked with a number of communities, so I can give it a general sense. And also just recognizing that tribal communities are not monolithic, so they don't have just one perspective within a community. There are many ranchers on the reservation, both native and non-native, and a lot of times that also impacts efforts of groups on the reservation to build bison herds, because even on the reservation, they're kind of challenged to find those places where they can restore bison, and where no one is going to criticize, efforts to restore bison. But to your question, generally ranchers see bison as competition for grass. Even when the bison are well managed, the projects are well managed, there's still kind of some challenges with people believing that the land would be better in cattle, and that somehow there is like some risk to having bison around, whether it's that they believe that bison have diseases that they should be concerned about, or whether it's that they think that somehow it's a safety risk, or that the bison are going to get out or come onto their place, whatever it might be. But I would say in tribal communities that recognizing that the tribal lands are generally parceled into, patches of thousands to tens of thousands of acres, that you can lease for whatever activity, some form of grazing. We're trying to, in a way, make the economic argument that yes, we will pay that lease payment to create a place for bison, help to get the program established, help to get some sort of mechanisms in place to generate revenue, and to work on the food sovereignty efforts under our World Wildlife Fund. Now has a Native Nations team, led by an Indigenous woman, Heather Dawn Thompson from Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe, really remarkable woman. And so working together, we're trying to restore bison in all the ways that we think that it can take hold, restore connection, have impact. And yeah, I guess I would say that even within tribal communities, it is still really complicated. There is still politics. There is still ways in which people may try and knock or undo what's happening. But that said, I think that once you get a herd established on many reservations, they have tribal buffalo programs. Some go all the way back to the 1970s. And so you've got now a period of over 50 years of bison being back. You do see, very biodiverse areas, including with prairie dogs and ferrets and swift fox. And, some conservation organizations have been working in that space and in close partnership for a long time with those projects. But, it's about maybe getting that foothold and demonstrating that it can be beneficial for the community, in ways that might allay people's concerns. And in the long run, like I think the other thing on reservations that a lot of people aren't aware of that I've seen is that, even in these rural, isolated communities on reservations, in some cases the children and the families are really urbanite in a sense. They stay in town. They don't have the same relationship with the land and the surroundings as they once did, And so when you create places for bison, you're actually also creating places for people, places where they know that they can access the land, because a huge portion of tribal lands, about half of tribal lands are leased to non-tribal interests in the Northern Great Plains. And so creating places where Native people know that they are welcome, where they can go and gather traditional medicines and foods, where they can just go and commune with the land and the buffalo. It has inherent value, and makes a difference. It does create places where people know that they can be and that they can be welcome. So
I think that's one of the maybe cool unexpected parts of this conservation story, right? Is that you're not just conserving the land and nature, but also historical traditions, right? I
yeah,
think it's just such a neat extra bit of this story that maybe goes under talked about, right? It's not just
yeah,
focusing on bison. It's like there's people here too that
yeah.
you're getting on site and restoring to them what they once had as well.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and there's a term that's often used called lifeways, and essentially it relates to spirituality and culture and ceremonies and everything, and getting the children back out on the land, and showing them how to harvest wild turnips and things like that, which are a traditional food, and even like thinking about foods that are palatable. Like I don't think people always realize what the reservation era did. Rations that were provided by the government were often unpalatable. Native people tend to be lactose intolerant, and they were forced to drink milk. They had never consumed sugar in like white sugar and even flour. They would make flour by other means, using like wild turnips and things like that. And so now you have chronic issues of chronic diabetes and heart health issues and so on. And so, like, reintegration of buffalo and reintegration of those lifeways is over time making people healthier, both mentally and physically. And again, like, I'm not claiming that WWF has a central role in that. We just want to support bringing bison back, and to the degree that our efforts can support nutrition and so on, we absolutely do that. And we are partners with amazing cultural organizations and community organizations on reservations, and we'll offer grants that go towards events and activities that get children out on the prairie and people out on the prairie and families out on the prairie, and support some of the education efforts and everything. But like, there are ceremonies that are becoming more prevalent again, like coming of age ceremonies for young women and young men, and the bison again figure centrally in so many ceremonies. I hate to create an equivalency with Christianity, because Christianity was part of what perpetrated a lot of the harm on reservations. But it is sort of like, with the buffalo coming back, it's a little bit like the return of Christ in Christianity. It's that, like, they revered buffalo for over and still practice ceremonies underground, because their religious and their religion and their spirituality became illegal. They were no longer allowed to practice it. But bison, in many cases, when we're doing these restorations, haven't been on that land for 130, 140, 150 years. And so you're bringing back something that's probably 6, 7 generations, that have been without buffalo. But some of the knowledge has survived, and maybe much of the knowledge has survived, and now they can start reintegrating it and teaching to young people, in the ways that they can.
It's so cool to hear these stories from y'all as the experts on all that WWF does, because again, I think, when I was a kid there was WWF, but you see the panda and then you think of like this charismatic large mammal, but there's so much more going on that the organization does. And it's just, I don't know, it's so heartwarming to have on y'all, the experts, and as y'all are talking about it, like the glimmer in your eyes as you're talking about what you do is, it brings me an incredible amount of joy to see. It's like, this is a group that my wife and I, when we started dating, the first things that she asked for her birthday was a WWF flamingo adoption kit,
Cool.
right? And so it's like we've been donating to WWF for over 15 years just as a couple, and just to see
Awesome.
like the impact that this support goes to, not just to like the beautiful panda, but to native peoples, restoring like cultural history, right? And it's
Mhm.
just so cool to see that someone so passionate as yourself telling us about these stories.
Oh,
I,
thanks.
I just I can't help but just keep smiling as you're talking. I'm just like, I
Yeah,
love hearing this, and I think the community does too. Is that passion's shining through, and that it's
cool.
like what we're believing in is really it's really, really cool. It's really remarkable. Just thank you for what you do. I have some and from the community too, with some
Yeah.
detailed questions about
Okay,
the
absolutely. I'll try.
no, it's about like the buffalo release onto the lands, right? Of like
Mhm.
bringing them back to a particular ecosystem. I think
Yeah,
one question is, and kind of you had alluded to it too, is do you need to bring back something like a predator when restoring
right.
bison lands? Like, is there, I don't know if a wolf would be like a natural predator of them, or is that
Right.
something where you've kind of measured out this is the carrying capacity of the land and we're going to be the
Yeah,
ones to call if we need?
right.
How does that system
Right.
work?
Yeah, so generally I'd say like in Yellowstone they did also bring back wolves, and so they are a predator of bison. I've actually heard that it's kind of a cultural thing though, whether wolves are capable of hunting bison. I think it happens more so up in northern Canada, that they know how to take down a bison, and of course they can always take down the young and the weak. But I would say for our work currently, and the system that we work in, which, like I said, is very much dominated by livestock grazing and operations, we aren't working on that piece of bringing wolves back. But that said, historically, the key predator of bison likely really was native people. And because we're restoring them on the order of hundreds or thousands of bison at any particular site, tribes are in a position to harvest those animals and to provide for their community. And again, like it's very site specific. So they will transfer bison to other tribes, gift bison to other tribes. Fort Peck has done an amazing job. They're a recipient of Yellowstone bison, which I guess you could say have both prized genetics, for having very low, what they call cattle gene introgression, where there isn't a lot of cattle genes that are a relic of kind of that first period when bison were being restored. And some people were either trying to breed a more hardy cow or a more docile bison, and so there was forced breeding. And so basically a relic of that is that there are cattle genes in most bison populations. The other thing about Yellowstone is that the animals were one of the last wild populations. Um, and even though they were reduced to about 25 animals in, I think, about 1905, ultimately their genetics are prized. So those animals that have been part of a quarantine um, project to ensure that they don't have brucellosis, which does occur in Yellowstone, they once they're certified brucellosis free, they get transferred to Fort Peck, and then Fort Peck transfers the animals to, um, I believe it's about 19 different sites, maybe more than that now, across the continent, all the way from an island off of Alaska to Oklahoma, I believe is the furthest extent. And there was a recent transfer to a couple of First Nations in Canada as well. So yeah, I guess I would just say that for the moment, humans are that top predator, and I suspect it's going to stay that way for a long time. Wolves are coming back into some of these systems, but they're not tolerated generally, and probably wouldn't last too long, unfortunately.
I'd imagine the community buy-in also for either the native
Yeah,
peoples or ranchers of you wanting to bring back wolves would be a very difficult sell because they probably
it
won't
would.
respect fences the way that,
Yeah,
I mean, like you said, the bison can hop the 6 foot fence. So like
right.
if
Yeah,
that one is
generally
gonna
they'll
have
stay where
trouble,
they are,
yeah.
but yeah, I think you're right, and that's something that maybe from a scientific perspective, it almost moves more into the realm of, or it does move into the realm of social sciences rather than biological sciences when you're not talking about an environmental carrying capacity, but essentially a social tolerance carrying capacity. And so that's really what in the plains and the northern Great Plains in particular, that's what you're dealing with because the other way of life besides indigenous way of life is ranching, and really a lot of species that were a threat to that way of life are no longer there. But if you look at the Lewis and Clark journals, which I would highly recommend, even if people just look at snippets, that was from 1804 to 1806, and they've actually done created some maps that show that when they were in the plains, they saw the greatest diversity and abundance of wildlife that they did anywhere on their journey. A lot of people think of wolves and grizzlies and things like that as species that reside in the mountains. But it actually turns out that was sort of their last refuge. They were just harder to get at in those places. But that when Lewis and Clark came through in 1804 to 1806, that they saw more grizzlies, wolves, elk, pronghorn, beaver, just, an insane amount of wildlife in the plains.
It's cool as you're describing it too that the plains aren't just this flat grass, right? Like it almost
Right.
seems like some of the imagery that we have associated today of the plains, like from whether it
Hmm.
be TV shows, movies, whatnot, is just
Yeah.
barren grass
Right.
and there's just nothing there, right? But
Yeah.
as you're painting us the picture of what was, what is being
Yeah.
restored, that's very, very different.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And when you get to some of those river valleys as well, those are biodiversity hotspots in the plains because where there's water, you get trees, and just habitat for so many more things. Yeah.
You mentioned the possibility of like for the Yellowstone animals, there was
Mhm.
this disease. Could you tell us a little bit
Right.
about what that is, and
Yeah.
do you need to be almost aware of it in the for the
Right.
plains habitat, and what does one need to do to ensure that that doesn't
Yeah.
come and infect?
Yeah, and sometimes, like it's almost better to not talk about it. And I don't mean in the sense like on a program like this, but there is only one reservoir of brucellosis in the country, and that is Yellowstone. And brucellosis occurs in bison and elk in that system, and it is a carryover from cattle um, that were first brought here. And then there was a major effort by the government to eradicate brucellosis in cattle herds. I believe it was probably somewhere between 1930 and 1960, something like that. And they were successful in eradicating brucellosis in cattle herds, although there's still vaccinations for brucellosis. But once you get into a wildlife situation, it's much harder to administer a vaccine. And brucellosis is a bacteria. It's called Brucellosis abortus. And um, the thing to know is that it tends to cause abortion in cattle. They're not so certain like whether it always causes abortion in bison. I think that it's a matter of that it can, but often, elk or bison can be carriers at certain levels. I think another thing to be aware of is that bison have really always been a species since they were first brought back that were confined, whereas elk really they have the freedom to move in and out of the park. And so there's never been a case of transmission of brucellosis from bison to cattle in that greater Yellowstone ecosystem, whereas they know via genetic analyses that there has been transfers between elk and cattle. But and that I think really has to do with I think it's when they come into contact with afterbirth, So after an elk gives birth, the placenta is on the landscape, and if they are carriers, then it can be transmitted to cows.
Is that
But
where
yeah,
the misnomer comes from, like you were talking about at the beginning of
yeah,
our conversation, of ranchers worrying that
yeah,
if you're buying bison land or renting bison in their area,
yeah,
that that's a disease, but really, like you said, that
right.
that isn't something that to worry about happening because it's you haven't
That's right.
showed the evidence for it.
Yeah, yeah. Both that and the fact that the majority of bison populations have no brucellosis because they aren't necessarily connected with that Yellowstone site. But for those animals that have been transferred from Yellowstone to a program that then transfers them across the continent, those animals have been in quarantine. At least the first animals that came out of Yellowstone and were transferred to Fort Peck had been in quarantine for over a decade, which is far more like than is actually required by science. I believe that for bull bison, it's something like 18 months that they actually, at this point, scientifically have to be in quarantine. And then for cows, it's after they have to be monitored after they give birth to their first calf to see whether they seroconvert, which I guess is something that can happen where it's only apparent that they have brucellosis after that through blood testing. Um, and so, yeah, essentially there is no risk from those animals that have been transferred from Yellowstone. And as you said, there has never been a transmission of an animal in Yellowstone to cattle outside or on the outskirts of Yellowstone. So um, I think that in a way it's a bit of a red herring, and just something that creates concern, but shouldn't for the most part when all of these appropriate mechanisms are in place to avoid any transmission. And like I think because in a way bison were never restored as wildlife the same way that elk are wildlife, where they can move across fences and move across the broader landscape, then you have a strong lobby for elk out there of hunters and conservationists who say, yeah, we have to let the elk roam free, and so they are allowed to roam free, which is wonderful. But then, they still pose a risk of brucellosis transmission, and meanwhile, bison essentially are typically hazed back into the park, and are considered a threat when um, they like there's just never been a documented case of transmission. So yeah,
Because it's a red herring, do you have to, like, again, I think this gets kind of like the education, the community
mm,
buy-in, right? Like you're saying,
right,
if it's not an issue, like it's this
yeah,
preconceived notion of it, but do you have to almost jump through hoops to show this? Like, do you have to go out and vaccinate against this in every bison that you have in the plains, or is it just more community education that you have to be like, look, this really isn't an issue. Let me show you the data. Let me walk you
right,
through it. Like, what does one
yeah,
have to do to make sure this is not an issue? Because like you even mentioned
right,
it right at the beginning without
right,
me ever prompting that this
yeah,
is a something that you're having to fight against, and it's
right.
I would imagine it's kind of frustrating. It's like not really anything to worry about.
Yeah, and there are calfhood vaccinations that are sometimes given in the bison industry, maybe in some cases with bison that are transferred, but we don't really get into that education process. What we tend to try to do is work with communities that want to see bison back. And it's very rare that issue gets brought up in that context. And if it does, we can provide data. We can bring colleagues from Yellowstone and to speak to groups. And I know Yellowstone does a great job of education. They have a great bison biologist there, Chris Jeremiah. Um, but I think it's as you know, I think it's easier to share a message of fear and controversy, and it spreads more quickly. And sometimes, it just feels like there isn't much fighting it with facts. Unfortunately, even though the science is there and they're continuing to improve that science.
To counter that message, then, do you have a favorite bison like positive story, right? Like, so
Yeah,
if someone were to listening to this part of the show and they're like, I've heard this thing about bison and we've talked about how it's
yeah,
not a factor really. What is something that someone can take on the opposite side of things? Like, let me tell you something
yeah,
really like positive, beautiful message about bison that would be an
right.
inspiring one.
I think in some ways there's both the human element of particularly Native children in these communities who are learning buffalo dances, buffalo songs, spending time on the landscape, that are again consuming bison. Actually, I'll tell you a really beautiful story that I think gets me a little bit choked up, and it defies science, but it relates to that piece of connection to buffalo and not necessarily knowing where it stems from. So one of my friends and colleagues, who was managing the buffalo on the Wolacota Buffalo Range, he and his wife were sleeping, and their daughter came to them and said, "We have to go and get little brother." And um, her mother was pregnant, and she said, "The baby's not coming yet, and we don't know if it's a boy." And she said, "No, we have to go and get little brother. You need to come with me. We got to go get him." And so they trust their kids and believe in them. And this little girl, I believe at the time was, I'm trying to remember, maybe 7 years old. And so they literally got dressed, got in their truck, and went for a drive. And they found an orphan calf right where their little girl said it would be. And they took in that orphan calf and raised it. And like how does that happen? How and again, I can't explain it, but I mean, to me, it's amazing, that connection is there. And again, I don't know, I don't know how to explain it, but it's amazing. And that little girl also, when they harvest buffalo in the traditional way, she's one of the people that teaches other grown-ups how to process a buffalo, the meat cutting and everything and all the different parts and their function and how they use them historically. And that's a little girl who's raised in the culture and in their ways. And again, I realize that some people might think, well, what's the link to conservation? But in a way, if there isn't a community and a people that embrace the return of the animal, there won't be places for them. And to me, that's at the heart of it, is that how do you restore that connection and that meaning and that place, so that it creates reconnection with culture, language, lands, animals, plants, and all of the nations that exist in that space, right? And that's the foundation of it. And it was all taken away and through imposed systems, indoctrination, etc. And this is the pathway to creating healthy people, healthy lands, a healthy way of life in a system where they want to be. And I think if I could finish with like a message on that front, I lived in the Northern Great Plains for 5 years with my family in a town of 36 people. My daughter was 6 months old when we moved there. At times, she was the only child right in town, but we did have Fort Belknap Reservation right next door, and we had a wonderful connection and experience to that community and friends and loved ones. And I lasted in that place for 5 years. And then, it was time for my daughter to start school, and the bus ride was like 3 hours round trip. And I just thought, my daughter can't sit still for 3 hours a day, going through all of these gravel roads to pick up all the kids in the surrounding area, just to have enough kids to get up to town. And so we moved to Bozeman, Montana, which is where our Great Plains program is headquartered. And there's probably about 40 to 50,000 people here. Great schools, great community. But in order for conservation to last, I believe it has to be embraced by the communities that live there. and ranchers keep grasslands intact. And I haven't talked a lot about that, but our program also works to a great extent with ranchers on keeping grasslands intact, and we work more so with the tribal communities on the restoration of bison, prairie dogs, black-footed ferrets, where they embrace the return of those species and others. But if conservation isn't embraced by the community that you work with, and the people who live there, who sustains it? I don't believe that conservation can just be imposed by an outside entity or agency through regulation, right? It is something that becomes a way of life, and I believe that in a way tradition sustains conservation, and if you can make something tradition, that's what will sustain it. And I think that's kind of what we're doing, and that's why we're working with the communities of that place. You can seed community, of course, but it's much harder to do. So really working with the people of a place is the way to sustain conservation, and so I think that connection and the restoration of that connection amongst Native people in the plains to the buffalo and other species and to the land and everything is at the heart of what we're supporting. We're a small player in a much bigger effort that's led by Native nations. So.
I think that's been a common theme with all of the interviews that we've had so far, is that without community buy-in, there is no conservation. And it's really cool to hear about the different approaches as well, because there's different peoples in the area that you have to connect with and get on board. You mentioned of maintaining the grasslands as well with the ranchers.
Yeah.
Why is that something that's critical and also being pursued at the same time as the as with the native peoples, right? I think it maybe makes a little bit more intuitive sense, like with those that want the species back, like sure, totally easy to catch. Why is it important to maintain also the grasslands?
Right.
And how what are some of the differences in working with the ranchers versus the native peoples?
Yeah. Now I'm going to butcher a quote, but I think they say something about like the essential of like useful tinkering is to keep all the pieces, something along those lines. And I really feel like the foundation is intact grasslands, right? And when you plow up grasslands, you're losing deep-rooted, diverse grass species, and you're getting something that's likely more of a monoculture. And it can be hard to go back, and it's a process that takes time. And so working with ranchers, their livelihood and their interest is in that diverse grassland that they have sustained for generations. Often the ranchers we work with may have been on the land for 4, 5 generations, verging on 100 years, if not more. And some will have areas where they grow hay so that they have hay for the winter for cattle that they do keep if they don't ship them all to market. And so they have a strong interest in continuing to sustain the grasslands in the way that their family has for 100 years. And, it's really interesting as well, because when the plains were first populated by through the Homestead Act and things like that, people were being given 160 acres, maybe 320 acres. And we know now that that's not enough to sustain anyone in many of these areas. There might be some that are extremely productive where you could say, maybe you can do something on 160 acres. But today, a lot of ranches are thousands to tens of thousands of acres as well, kind of like that scale I was talking about it with buffalo. And so, to have a viable operation, like I know some ranchers who talk about that from their home or their parents' home, they could see 57 tar and paper shacks that used to be all of these individual ranches, and like all of these people that came to try and make a better life, and they're gone now. And there's, the rancher with the one larger operation that has kind of bought up all of these smaller operations. And at the same time, talking to some of those ranchers who might be in their, their 60s, let's say, maybe a little bit older, 60s to 70s, they were teenagers before they saw their first deer or their first antelope, pronghorn, on the prairie. And that's because when you had people on 160 to 320 acres and it just wasn't cutting it in terms of having a cow or two or whatever, you had to go hunting. And so essentially in that landscape, pronghorn, deer, elk were all wiped out because the peak of population in a county that now has a few thousand people was like 20,000 people that lived there in the 1920s. Um, and so deer came back. Like I said, they saw their first deer when they were in their teens. Pronghorn came back on their own. They had to do an active restoration of elk in the 1950s, where the ranchers worked with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to bring elk back in trailers. There's now thousands of them. I think they started with 50 or so animals. Um, and so, again, ranchers are sustaining the majority of the biodiversity that can exist on the plains. But I think that both, like recognizing that beaver might not always be welcome because there's few trees on those landscapes, few streams, and it's nice to keep your trees if you have them. That prairie dogs, ferrets, although prairie dogs might be on their land, they're not necessarily welcome, and they're trying to minimize the spread if they can. And I'm generalizing. This is pretty broad generalizations, but I know of one rancher who has mountain plovers on his property, and he takes pride in that because they do hone in on those areas where prairie dogs live. And a researcher actually was responsible for that. Said, you've got mountain plovers. Do you mind if I study them? And started teaching the rancher about the mountain plovers. So and eventually it's like a point of pride. And I think, our sustainable ranching initiative does do ecological monitoring, where working with ranchers, they look at the bird community that's on the property. They develop plans on how cows could be managed, and it's together. It's not us dictating anything, but I think there's those species that might not come back on ranch lands, and that's again where our wildlife team has a role in restoring those animals to other sites where they do embrace their return. But that said, I believe it's about 70% of the northern Great Plains, which is about 183 million acres, is privately owned. And so in terms of trying to achieve scale of grassland conservation and avoiding plow up, working with ranchers is pretty critical to keeping grass right side up, as we might say, instead of plowed. And there is economic incentive to plowing the grasslands, sometimes not even because they are suitable for crops, but rather because you can sell farmland for more than you can ranch land. The real estate value is higher. And so there's some perverse incentives as well, in terms of you plant a crop. If it doesn't work out, you get 80% of the value of the crop, or something along those lines, So I think that working with ranchers that want to be ranchers and that want to keep the land intact, again, it's about working with those communities that have values that are aligned and that want to see the same thing that you do, because they are the ones that are going to sustain conservation in those places.
It's wild to think about how you're describing it, that all land is actually not equal, right? Because of
Mm.
what the monetary value is put on it. So
Right.
not only are you competing with now preconceived notions, like we've talked about, with whether or not they
Yeah.
carry disease or if they're annoying, right? But now it's like you're fighting on the financial side of things as well, which again goes to show why it's so important to have these donations coming in so you can kind of offset some of those other, I guess, financial struggles that could be imposed, or financial gain that someone could get short term versus the environment being maintained long term.
Right. Yeah. And I would say, again, the ranchers are the visionaries in that context, and our program works to bring resources that make the practices that they want to have on their land more feasible for them, and their bottom line, so that they can be the best managers, and the managers that they want to be, with the resources that they need.
I love, Dennis, that you've been leading us through this, like the logic kind of what goes into this, like conservation work, but also the ins and out and the details of it. Like it's been really illuminating to hear just all these elements that go in, and it's one of those where I think every person we've talked to, it's the question comes across as how the heck do you do it? Because this is not something that is just as simple as, all right, we're going to put some bison here, right? It's there is so much that you are having to juggle to make this successful. It's really incredible that it ever works. Um,
Yeah.
do you have a personal favorite success story when it comes to one of these conservation efforts where it's either it was, really easy, really hard, but like the
Yeah.
output of it led
Yeah.
to what you consider as like, look, I did something very meaningful here.
Yeah. Well, I guess it might sound like a cop out, but I feel like that with every project that we do and every community that we work with. So I haven't really like said it to this point, but our goal is to work with 15 nations and bison herds and programs to restore bison to 500,000 acres by 2030. Um, and we're already in the neighborhood of nearly 400,000 acres, and we're starting work at our 12th site. And again, every one of those sites, every one of those communities has a unique story, has amazing visionaries and drivers and community organizations and people who are involved in the efforts to reconnect with buffalo. I think actually in a way, I'm most excited about a new prospect. And I think that gets at what I was talking about, that if you can demonstrate how to make programs sustainable, that, over time, the example that you create inspires others and creates an opportunity for us to work at new scales. So, we only work in communities where we're invited and with partners where we're invited. And it isn't that long ago that we were invited to work with the Crow Nation in south central Montana. And they've had bison since the 1930s, on and off. Unfortunately, they had a herd of 1,000 bison in that they started in the 1930s, and in the 1960s, they were told that the herd had brucellosis, even though it was not documented. And so the government played a role in having all of those animals killed. They then started a new herd in the 1970s, and that herd is currently at about 470 animals, and it's in the Bighorn Mountains, which kind of stretch up from Wyoming into the reservation. And I went there recently, and the habitat is between 6,500 feet and 10,000 feet, and just some of the most beautiful country you've ever seen. Quite different than most of our projects because it is mountains within plains. But that said, the exciting part to me is that it's the first project where essentially we're not going to be dealing with any fences for bison. The entire area is bounded by cliffs and canyons. The Bighorn River flows along the west side. And so it's all going to be geographic and geological barriers that contain the herd. And they do migrate from their winter range is at the low elevation within those mountains. And then they migrate up to higher elevations in the summer to graze. And there's great water sources and everything. And so we're helping to lease an additional 60,000 acres there, and they already had like 40, around 40,000 acres. So when all is said and done, just the grass portions of the habitat will be, I think it's about 90,000 acres of grass, and then total the habitat that the bison will have access to will be approximately 120,000 acres. And I've never done anything that big. And I mean, I think it will be one of the biggest areas that's unfenced, but that bison have access to. And there are black bears there, there are elk there. It's just such a beautiful place. And so I think that what I love is that you can create examples of what you want to see in the world, and that can inspire others, and that they dream bigger. And then you get to be part of something like that, and you get invited to be part of it. So yeah, I feel so fortunate to do the work that I do as my dream job, And I'll be happy just continuing to do what we're doing if I have that privilege.
That sounds absolutely gorgeous of how you're describing it too, like the changes in just altitude as well, the different
Yeah.
biodiversity that you can have. Is there ever an opportunity for ecotourism to be involved in this where you can, because it honestly, as you're describing, like, man, I really want to go there too and see this.
Yeah.
Is that something that's feasible for someone listening at home? Is there a market for that? Or because it's, like different legalese of like the protected lands, is
Yeah.
that really not happening at the current state?
No, so there is ecotourism. We work with a couple of organizations. Natural Habitat Adventures is the tourism partner of WWF, and they have done tours to the Great Plains before. There's also a group here in Bozeman called Off the Beaten Path. There's something called Yellowstone Safaris as well, and not all are related to visiting reservations, but I think that that's an area that will be fruitful for these groups as they build capacity, and often that's part of our investment is giving people the opportunity to work in all of the different programs and services that can be associated with bringing bison back. And over time, as the programs grow, as their economic base grows, as their sustainability grows, they can explore opportunities like this. But it kind of begins with what are those bases that they need to cover initially, and then gradually they venture into others. And I know the Blackfeet also have had some like amazing experiences where you can help move the bison from winter range to summer range on horseback, and like just some amazing things. And so I think there's a lot coming, and I would encourage people to come to the Great Plains and explore places like American Prairie, like seeing sage grouse lekking, for example, is an amazing spectacle. On the Charles M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge, seeing elk bugling, and it's like hundreds to thousands of elk that you can see in the fall. And yeah, there's just so many spectacles that I think people should come and see. And of course, bison, prairie dogs. It's difficult to see ferrets, and I don't think that you can necessarily go out and spotlight them as our researchers do. But maybe in the future there'll be opportunities like that as well.
I, I love that it kind of builds into the idea of sustainability too, right? Like you have the economic sustainability, then you have more people could have buy-in because wow, isn't this beautiful? When we want to maintain this, and it just kind of hopefully feed forward where
Yeah.
eventually, hopefully, we don't have to argue for something like this one day.
Yeah, no, that's right. And again, I think that doing it in places where people embrace it is a seed of something bigger. And like I said, people dreaming bigger and saying, well, if 20,000 acres, why not 100,000, or why not a significant portion of our reservation, in the long run. But again, that's entirely up to the communities. I could just imagine that with something good, something better comes.
I have one more bison question for you before I want
Yeah.
to hear about the artwork behind you.
Oh,
Uh,
sure.
when we release the bison into like
Yeah.
a new habitat, like you're talking about, like this
Yeah.
non-enclosed but geographically enclosed
Yeah.
area, there presumably is going to be differences in during the time of year of what food is available and where it's available, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because you're releasing these animals into a place where they didn't grow up, let's say, right?
Right.
Is
Yeah.
there anything that you have to do to train them to know where to go, or is natural instinct enough for them to know what to eat, and when to move?
Great question. I guess I would say probably instinct is key, but that said, one thing that's really cool about bison is that they tend to be matriarchal, and that there is a lead cow in a herd. And one thing that has become more important over time is discussion of social structure and dynamics in bison herds. And so those animals that have been transferred from Yellowstone to Fort Peck, often they'll try and see if they can maintain family groups when they transfer bison. And lead cows tend to teach the younger animals what to graze on, likely when to graze. They will find water at sites that they haven't been to if there are springs, things like that, and they'll start to get the lay of the land and show others how are we going to use this place. So I guess I would say that like there is an element of being naive to a landscape, but also of exploration and discovery, and then that becoming habit. So yeah,
That's really cool. It's Noel was talking to us about that as well, like the social structure of the prairie dogs, for example, right? And
yeah,
how it like it's a colony, but then there's all these subgroups to it and like smaller family units and how those feed in. And she mentioned to us like when they had to rehome an entire
yeah,
colony, like and all that you have to learn, right? About like how it's organized and
yeah,
totally makes sense you have to do that. And it's
yeah.
just so cool to hear about that level of complexity as well, these animals. And it's like the side effect of doing the conservation is also you get to learn about them and their
Oh,
native
absolutely.
biology. Yeah. Is
Yeah.
there
Well,
a bison fun fact that you have where it's like it's rare maybe? Like I think the
uh,
matriarchal part, right? I had no
yeah,
idea. I think that's really cool. Is
yeah.
there something else where you're like, this is a really, really neat fact about these animals?
Oh, okay. So one thing that I think is super cool is that, I think that in a way, bison create space for more grass in grasslands. And like one observation at American Prairie was that the bison would go to yucca plants, and you might be familiar with yucca. They are extremely sharp. The barbs at the end of each leaf or structure, like if you were to touch it, you'd bleed. Now, a bison comes along, and at certain times of year when all of the grass is cured, there's very little moisture in it, very little water in it. They will shove their face into that plant, which, like I said, is so prickly. They'll latch onto it with their teeth, and they'll pull it out of the ground. And the root is one of the few things that is like moist and full of water at that time of year, and they'll proceed to eat the root. So they're just feeding. But what you see on a lot of landscapes is that yuccas start to dominate the landscape when bison haven't been there for, a century. And so they're now going in and they're changing that. They start removing the yucca, and they make more room for the grasses that they also feed on. And it's just by virtue of trying to get at that root and to secure that moisture. So, it is interesting to think about how those keystone species can shape a landscape and change its structure over time when you bring them back. Um, and it's not to say that they're going to wipe out, every yucca plant or anything like that, but they're making room for other things. And I'm sure you've talked about this on your program, but disturbance is also key in a landscape, right? To creating places like, a lot of times what we call weeds grow in places where humans have disturbed the landscape, and there is space for natural disturbance and creating openings for other things to establish themselves and colonize, and seeds to spring up and stuff. So I thought that was something really cool that I learned about bison.
That's incredible. It goes into show too that they're almost terraforming the ecosystem, right? Of
Yeah,
like it's as simple as tearing up and taking for the water source, but like you said, the native plants, the native flowers, that grazing land for the animals that are there, presumably the pronghorn, the elk, like huge impact on just pulling up a root.
yeah, absolutely.
It's
Yeah.
it's so cool to learn about these animals, Dennis. Like I just yeah, the appreciation that I have for them too. Like I already thought they were just majestic and beautiful, but the amount of impact that they have is on, human culture, on the
Yeah.
land. What a charismatic and glorious animal.
Yeah. It makes me think of one other thing. So, um, I don't know if anyone shared this fun fact, but bison wool is actually warmer than sheep's wool. They are starting to use it as like a downfill for like high tech clothing and stuff like that, and pricey clothing. But birds line their nests with shed bison wool, and like when bison are shedding, sometimes it'll almost come off in sheets. So there's lots of it. But what they've actually found is that grassland birds that line their nests with bison wool have greater fledging success. So that insulative value then in turn, allows more native chicks to survive. And I'm sure that there's many other things, whether it's rodents and other like probably burrowing owls and other things that are collecting that wool as well. So Kind of cool.
That that is really, really cool. It's like not even now that we have the grasses, right? We've got the potential food source, maybe not in the plains with the wolves, but other parts, right? And
Right.
then on top of it, oh yeah, other survival mechanisms for animals like home building is building upon
Right.
the presence of this. So it really is one of
Yeah.
those. I think it's a hard phrase, right, of what isn't a keystone species, because I feel like a lot
Right.
of animals that if you remove, you're gonna cause a disturbance.
Yeah.
But this is a very easy one, I think, to see like the
Yeah.
importance of why we should keep it going in a particular area.
Yeah, and like we haven't talked a lot about those relationships, but also just the kind of patchy grazing. Bison graze on the move rather than staying in one spot for the most part. They really do key in on like prairie dog towns because with the short vegetation, there's higher protein value in the grasses on prairie dog towns. But basically that patchy grazing, I like to think of it as real estate almost. And birds and a number of other species key in on different types of real estate. So some want the single family dwelling, single story. Some of them want like an apartment building. Some of them want high rises, right? And because bison will preferentially graze and move while they graze, you'll get that patchiness. And like in cattle grazing, it's not to say that you can't get that same patchy effect depending on how you manage the animals, but um, my sense of ranching is that you want to remove the grass to produce as much meat as possible to get it to market, right? And so even though you'll not overgraze, you'll keep rotating your cattle, you're going to get sort of a more uniform grazing and a more uniform real estate structure, if you want to look at it that way. And so grassland birds really key in on different vegetation structure. Some love like bare ground and very short grass, like the mountain plover who nests on the prairie dog towns and in areas that are heavily grazed. And then you have species like Sprague's pipits that want really wolfy grass, where it hasn't been grazed for a long time. And if you think about historically, bison also like not just being those that are confined today, but the way that they moved across the plains, they might hit a place hard at one point in time and not be back for years. They were moving across country, across huge areas. And so all of these bird species evolved with those signals and with that varying vegetation structure. And so you do get maybe a little bit better representation of all of those different types of habitats. And the other thing that we also haven't talked about is bison wallowing. So bison rolling in the dirt, both I think just as almost like a sunscreen or like to deal with insects and stuff like that. But also when there's the rut and the males are rutting, they will urinate and they will roll in it to get all musked up and everything to make themselves as attractive as possible. But wallowing, like it can create just a depression in the soil that is the size of, I don't know, maybe a few bison wide in a circle, and it's just bare ground in a little depression. But historically, there are images of entire wetlands being created by buffalo wallowing. And each of those places, whether it's just a small depression, and often the smaller depressions happen in really clay soils. So when it rains, those depressions will hold water. That's enough for um, toads on the landscape to lay their eggs, for those eggs to develop into toadlets and then to disperse on the landscape. And so when you think about the Great Plains and the fact that water is often ephemeral, it's often in temporary streams and rivers and everything, then to have this network of potholes and wetlands across the entire plains. Again, it's a little bit like the prairie dogs and bite-sized meat being everywhere. Imagine bites, like widely distributed pools across the plains. Then suddenly you have places where amphibians can reproduce en masse across the landscape and where birds and other things can access small bits of water without having to be right on a stream. And so like sometimes I do think about the fact that I don't know when and how long it'll be before we can really glimpse everything that these landscapes represented and looked like. Yellowstone might be one representation, but it's not entirely in the plains. It's a mountainous landscape. But I think that's the other exciting thing, is that I think we'll just keep seeing more of these relationships over time, like the Kanza Prairie study, where they showed that biodiversity of native plant species doubled over 30 years. There aren't a lot of those long-term data sets in this space. I think people are working on them and analyzing them and everything, and developing them with new sites and all of that. But I think it's going to take time, but I think we're going to see a lot of important relationships restored, and we'll be able to see the difference as well, and that's the exciting part. Like when we talk about spectacles on the plains, that those are coming back and will come back and do exist.
The imagery of it too is really exciting to hear, that the wallow, like there's direct behaviors that are leading to these increased massive biodiversity, and the wallowing in particular. Is that for this wallowing, because it could be like a sunscreen with this dirt, is that the
Yeah,
entire family unit that would be participating in this to expand the size of what that pond eventually could be?
right,
And if so, like what is the size of one of these family units? Like it's
right,
matriarchal, like you were telling us, but
right.
how many buffalo are we talking? Um, or sorry, bison.
Yeah.
I see I'm catching up
Yeah,
into
well,
too.
so I also say buffalo half the time because I work so much with tribal communities. So yeah,
So,
yeah,
how many of the buffalo or again, geez, again,
yeah.
I did it. The
Bison,
bison
yeah,
are rolling around in a given
yeah,
area, like for the family unit size, because I think that can give a really nice
yeah,
visual impact of the
sure.
pond that's being created.
Yeah, so like I think that, and I can't have to say I haven't seen it documented, but that, once a wallow is established, it continues to be used as long as there are bison in those pastures. I think males probably wallow more so than females, but don't quote me on that. Um, and yeah, I mean, they do get repeated use. And I think one other thing that's really cool, and then again, this kind of links back to like full circle. Um, a gentleman named Jason Baldus, who's Shoshone and from the Wind River Reservation, he did his master's at Montana State University in Bozeman, and he studied medicinal plants at wallows, and found that there was a greater prevalence of medicinal plants growing in historical wallows. And we have seen just some work as well on that. It creates, again, disturbance that allows for plant species that are not necessarily growing other places to grow. So, to your question, they get used a lot when bison are in a particular area, and they get used repeatedly, and they do grow. But at the same time, it is almost by virtue of what type of soils you have. So when you have those harder clay soils, it may take much longer to create a large depression than if you're in an area where maybe there's more moisture, more loam in the soil or something like that. And that's actually where I think sometimes some of those areas where there was entire wetlands, it might have been places that have more moisture than where I've typically worked.
It's really cool. We have, Dennis, some images as well that you had sent
Yeah,
over, as well as the image behind you. Do you have time to just kind of
yeah,
walk
for
us
sure.
through, or like,
Yeah,
do you want to start with the
I can
painting?
try.
Do you want to start with the bison? What would you want it to do?
Um, well, maybe I'll talk about the painting behind me. I don't know how much people have seen it. I'm kind of in the way. Um, this is a painting by Daryl Growing Thunder, who is from Fort Peck Reservation. And it's something that's called ledger art. And when tribes were first forced onto reservations and to come to forts for rations, um, in the, I guess, late 1800s, and onward, um, they were given ledgers, or found them, like historical record keeping ledgers, and just started doing sketches, drawings, and everything, and paintings and things like that on those ledgers, and it has emerged as a traditional art form since that time. And so, yeah, there's a lot of symbology, and a lot of the people that refer to themselves as buffalo people are also star people, and so those symbols on the buffalo are stars. And there's hoof prints at the bottom, and yeah, I have to say I'm not as strong on all of the symbology, but there's dragonflies also are another species that they have a symbol for. So anyway, and yeah, if we want to go to some images, we can. That'd be great.
The painting is truly beautiful, Dennis. Like I'm just
Thanks.
you pointed out the hooves at the bottom, and I was
Yeah,
just like, oh yeah, I didn't see those before. And it's like,
yeah.
wow, that is like
Mm.
a really cool bit of detail to be able to see on these. Yeah. Um,
Yeah, so
so
that's at
as
Wool Lakota Buffalo Range.
yeah, so as we bring up some of these images, I think one question that came out too earlier is is there a visual cue that tells you that this is a bison? Like, is it one where it's like the hump and the horn size is like
Right.
an indicator? I imagine there's not much on the plains that looks
Yeah,
very similar, but is there something for like if I'm at a zoo, how I could
yeah.
visually tell if these animals were around with other things?
Yeah, I would say probably the hump is kind of a key one. That's something that both males and females have. It develops to a greater extent as they get older. And the function of the hump in some ways is just for attachment of like large muscles. And like in the winter, bison have to sweep snow away on the plains in order to get at forage. And so those muscles that attach on their hump allow them to push huge amounts of snow if necessary to get at forage underneath. And that's another kind of unique role of bison in systems, is that a lot of the smaller species would have more trouble accessing vegetation in winter underneath deep snow, especially like places like Yellowstone and stuff. And so I suspect in this part, I'm not so certain about it, hasn't been documented, but the highways that bison herds would have created through deep snow, they're capable of moving through things like that. And we've seen it at Yellowstone. But that likely would have created highways for a number of other species historically, I suspect. And then once they were kind of digging for forage, then that would have allowed elk and pronghorn and deer to access things underneath the snow as well. But yeah, I would say their hump is probably one of their most distinctive features. Um,
It's cool that it's
yeah,
muscle that you were saying, right? It's
yeah,
like I think
yeah,
one maybe go-to thought thing is like, oh, is that like a camel fat reserve?
right.
Right, but it's cool that it's muscle, and also like I imagine there might be some kind of social nuance here where pronghorn and other animals might be almost eavesdropping during the winter of where the
Yeah,
bison are hanging out just so they can get
right.
to the vegetation. So it's again
Yeah,
that interconnectedness of the ecosystem that you were talking about.
for
It's like,
sure.
oh, it's like year round happening and in different ways.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I think we could go. That was just really early on in a restoration project, and this image as well, same. And these photos would have been by Clay Bolt. So
He's so
you got to
good.
visit with
He
him.
was showing
Yeah,
us some of his
he is.
insect photography or in the earlier interview,
Yeah,
and it was like, Clay, you're so good. He's like, yeah, just National
yeah,
Geographic that I do. I'm like, are
yeah,
you just kidding me? You just
yeah.
threw that in there?
Yeah, and actually, I should say that some of these images might also be from Noelle Guernsey,
Hmm.
who is a photographer in her own right. So now I can't say 100%, but I suspect that the one on the left is a bull, and the one on the right is probably a cow or else a younger bull. But you can tell by the thickness of the horns. I'm pretty sure that that's a cow. If you look at the base of the horn,
Hmm.
and sorry, I'm pointing at the image, and I know you
No,
guys
no,
can't
that's
see
totally
that. But
fine.
if you look at the base of the horn, and then you look at that bare patch around their eye,
Hmm.
for a bull, the base of the horn will tend to be kind of larger than that eye patch, whereas on the other animal, the base of the horns is smaller. That said, the way that the horns curve for both animals, it does make me wonder if it's just a younger bull or whether it's a cow on the right. But that said, kind of the going out first and then up tends to be more a trait of the bulls.
Are the horns usually just like that singular tipped, or do we have like with deer where it's the multi-point?
Always singular tipped. And actually, one cool thing that you can see on the left, the animal on the left, is that you see how it's kind of got like more of a whitish brown quality towards the head. What happens is that when bison are rutting, they're rubbing their horns on the ground, and on shrubs and different things, and they actually get polished smooth. And when an animal gets really old, so males basically are in their prime between 8 and 13 years old, and um, they'll actually like it'll start to almost like flake apart at the ends because they're reaching the end of their kind of reproductive time, and they'll be pushed out by other bulls at that point, like who can outcompete them or that gang up, and eventually you have bulls that are sort of like are retired from breeding, and they're lone bulls, and they sort of just graze out on the periphery or really quite far from the herd. And the males really, for the most part, only come around to the cow herds during the mating season. And otherwise, like you will have young bulls that are still with their mothers until they start getting frisky in the herd, and then they get pushed out, and then they form bachelor herds that again are peripheral to that cow herd.
And the bachelor herds can gang up on an alpha to push it out. Then how do they
Yeah,
decide who of the bachelor herd is now next in
yeah.
line for the throne?
I mean, it is a matter of it's pretty brutal. Like they can be hard on each other, and like I wouldn't be surprised if it's a sort of a social dynamic and a bit a bit of like trial and error where there are those prime bulls that are starting to compete with the the um, the dominant bull, and maybe they're at a point where it's like, okay, I can't quite beat him, but if I just get George over here, then me and George can push him out, and then it's my turn, kind of thing. And the bulls do tend to cows. So like when they are breeding a cow, they'll stay with them for an extended period, and they'll try and make sure that all of the other bulls are staying away. So, I mean, there's opportunity, and I'm sure again, through your work and speaking to other researchers, there's also those that have a kind of a sneaker strategy. So they don't have to be the biggest bulls necessarily if they maybe sneak an opportunity somewhere. So that I'm sure that happens as well. It's not always the dominant bull that's breeding the cows, but that said, it often is. And that's also another reason why, like in closed systems, like when we're restoring bison, I know at American Prairie they would sometimes actually shift out the herd bull and just like transfer that dominant bull to another site because they wanted to keep their genetics as diverse as possible.
Makes sense. Yeah, like if you're already sequencing who it is, you
Yeah,
have this two potential males, just push them around to the site that needs it. And then I guess you'd probably have to have some insurance policy they were taken as the dominant male in the new site. But yeah,
right.
the
Yeah.
sneak attack imagery too is a is a good one, because you're right, it is a
And it's
mechanism
funny.
that works, right? If
Yeah.
you are
Yeah,
able
that's
to
right.
distract the alpha, then you can mate and
Yeah.
you just leave. Yeah, it's
Right. Yes.
there's so much extra science here that I feel like hasn't been talked about or researched,
Yeah.
like sperm competition and multiple
Right.
males, and yeah, just
Yeah.
like from their life history. Super
Yeah. And if
cool.
you ever want to speak to a scientist who I know is like top rate, Jeff Martin at South Dakota State University has done a lot of amazing research on bison, and he would be the person that I would invite to come and talk to you about, like how climate impacts on bison and the fact that it's actually gradually making bison smaller over time, because the grass is not as protein and nutrient rich as it was, and they can see across like kind of the climate gradient because bison exist all the way from Alaska to Mexico, that by looking at the various climate situations that exist across that entire range, they're actually saying, yeah, the bison are getting smaller and are going to continue to get smaller under the current climate scenarios.
That's another lovely variable for you to deal with, right? Is how
Right.
the climate
Yeah.
is changing and how the
Yeah.
ecosystem is going to change in response to that. And now you have on top of
Yeah.
that the changes in size for the bison. Like,
Yeah.
Dennis, there's just no winning, but yet you're somehow making it work, which is again all
Yeah.
the more like incredible that this, life finding way. My wife saw this image earlier. She
Oh,
walked in and she's like, "Oh my God, they're so cute." The baby
yeah.
bison.
And the term in the Dakota, and Nakota language for the calves, they sometimes call them red dogs. And they really have that cinnamon color. And I think like in a lot of species, that probably is sort of a signal for them being like something that you have to care for and that you have to be careful with and everything, right? Like and so generally by fall they are taking on the color, well, pretty well always by fall they are taking on the color of their parents, but they are born that beautiful cinnamon color. And the cows go off on their own. They're quite secretive when they're actually going to give birth, and then eventually they'll come back to the herd. And my understanding is that you do see a little bit of like, oh, can we meet your calf kind of thing, and cool like social dynamics there as well. And then so a bison from when they are 2 or 3 years old until they are till the end of their life, 18, 19, 20, will have a calf annually unless there's issues with nutrition or parasites or something like that. But typically they'll have a calf every year.
Is it usually just
For
a one size of a cat, like a
Yes,
singular one?
yes, it's very rare that there are twins. And there, that said, we have seen some interesting things where and this comes from tribal partners, that if a cow dies, sometimes there will be almost like an adoption of the orphan, and so another cow might nourish that calf. But in terms of twins, it's very rare.
That's a really, really cool like behavioral observation as well. That there, because like you mentioned, it's this matriarchal family unit, and that
Yeah,
hits home even more so that it is a family unit versus just like here's a rando and here's another rando. There's like
right.
these more intricate connections between the animals.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think this one too was a really, really cool
Uh,
shot of seeing the little
yeah.
one there.
Yeah. And I think this is another one of Clay's images. And yeah, I love it. Yeah.
It
And
is the
yeah.
skin here of the adult kind of the shedding that you were talking about,
Yeah,
almost like
that's
with the
right. Yeah.
pieces.
So typically like the hair that's at the very front from the front leg and up, that will stay, but they're shedding off their winter coat from their back. And they call that the cape. And on the wood bison, it's more typical that they have like a fairly uniform length of hair across their entire body, whereas on the plains bison, you have that cape and the chaps on the front legs there, and then the rest gets, they kind of say like slicked off, where like it'll come off in sheets sometimes. Like you'll see hair just like in these big sheets on the prairie, and I mean it's warm. If you ball it up in your hand, you can almost immediately feel this warmth in your hand. It's amazing.
And then I like how it's now becoming the chic thing to use in down
Right.
coats, you were saying, but then
Yes.
also the birds have been using it. Like it's just
Yes.
given our conversation today, right? I
Yeah.
think seeing this image now
Yeah.
is so much more meaningful because of all the things that we can tease apart of the impact that this animal
Mhm.
has and just like the little details even of the fur, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And not to go like sort of gory, but bison leather is also one of the toughest leathers that exists. And that's actually part of what fueled the killing of bison. Not that like there was a concerted effort to kill them, but the hides were tanned and used as belts for machinery in the Industrial Revolution. And so that was kind of the economics behind it, was that, oh yeah, like let's get those hides. And so, there was just, I think it was in a matter of 3 or 4 years when the railroad arrived in Montana, that about 16 million hides were shipped east to tanneries. and then some cases went to Europe and or stayed in the East to fuel the Industrial Revolution.
16 million for that number.
Yeah, right.
It's a
Yeah,
crazy number.
yeah.
Hard again to process.
Yeah, and you're not seeing it here, but it's interesting because like sometimes you'll see cowbirds sitting on the backs of the bison, and it's kind of interesting that they're called cowbirds when actually, they're associated with bison probably originally. So
Are they like cleaning parasites like what you
I
see
think
with the
insects
with
and things like
buffalo,
that.
with I'm using the
Yeah,
correct phrase now of like the
yeah,
water
yes,
buffalo. Cool.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in their ears and yeah, in their coats and everything. Yeah.
Are those also, I would imagine those birds are also now making a return as the food source of like the bison that could carry the parasites are coming back, and then the birds can come back too because they have diets, or
I'm sure that's all part of it. And actually, another person I know, Ed, no, pardon me, Wes Olson, has written some amazing books about all of the relationships with respect to bison mucus and all of these things. And I have to say, I can't speak to all of those relationships, but he'd be a great person to do that because he's watched bison and managed bison for decades with national parks in Canada. So.
it's so cool. I thank you for humoring all my questions, Dennis. It's
Oh
just
yeah,
such a fun system to learn about and talk about, and seeing like the red color here on
yeah,
the little ones. Like
yeah,
it's almost, it's super cute. Like I'd want to snuggle with
yeah.
this little dude, but then
Right.
like you said, they end up becoming quite big, and the six
Yeah.
foot jumping is still getting me
Oh
in
man,
terms of the
yeah, and
height.
that's like a 4 foot. That's a 4 foot jump, so it's almost more like a lope or a hop or something. Yeah,
It's so
and they're
cool.
fast too. Like that's one thing. I was actually I did sort of a public service article one time about um, like how quickly a buffalo could get to you when you're in Yellowstone, and like why you need to keep your distance because they could cross a football field in 6 seconds. And so if they can cross a football field in 6 seconds and you are letting your kid wander off close to a bison, like how do you expect you're going to get your hands on your child or your loved one before something bad happens if you're doing something you shouldn't and not respecting the animal in their space.
Is that something where it's a more likely to happen when there's these young ones around, like the infants, or is it
Oh,
just like a
absolutely.
general, like we're protecting the herd from this unknown variable that's coming in, bit
Yeah.
of both?
Yeah. I think young ones are key, but I also think that during the rut when bulls are more feisty because they're breeding, they just there's greater risk there too. And then I think the other thing is that people, I think, in some senses have just gotten used to both a petting zoo kind of mentality and like I want to hug them or I want to touch them or I want a great selfie. And like really thinking about that, like that a bison can cross a football field in 6 seconds, like we can't compete with that. And nor should we try, just maintain a healthy distance just like you would. Like I've seen bison that will throw a hay bale that weighs 1 ton with their head, like literally with a horn just flicking their neck. Well, if they can do that to something that weighs thousands of pounds, what can they do to you? And I think we've all seen some of those videos of things that have happened to people who got too close and these days with everyone having a camera, it gets on film.
Yeah, I think a new fear has been unlocked, which is probably a good thing,
Yeah.
right? Because you don't want to
Yes.
go up to them and take selfies. Like
Yeah.
it is a wild animal at the end of the day, and
Yeah.
it's not. I think it's important, like you were mentioning, to
Yeah.
respect the wildlife
Yeah.
while, like in many ways, I guess, throughout this conversation, right?
Yeah.
How the native peoples respect, but also from that conservation perspective of you want to keep the animal wild anyway, so you
Yeah.
don't want it to just be okay with you snuggling at it, right?
No, that's
Yeah.
right. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
see everything's linked together of how we're talking about. We're going on some rabbit holes, but we're having fun with it. And is
Yeah.
this
This
the tagging, I imagine, right? Is what we're seeing here?
Actually, you know what it is that this was the release at Lakota Buffalo Range in, I believe, 2020. And these animals all came from national parks. I believe it was Badlands National Park, and I'm trying to remember. They had 100 animals. Badlands and Theodore Roosevelt. And so at the park, they had been ear tagged to distinguish individuals and the source of the animals. But yeah, this was that initial release out onto the prairie, and it was so cool to see because they were in a corral where they had been held for a time just to kind of settle. And they did 4 rounds of the corral inside, and then they came out. And it was interesting because for the native people, that number has significance in their stories and culture and everything. And then the buffalo went out onto the prairie, and then once they felt comfortable, they stopped and they looked back, and then they just kind of got to know this new place. And there was 100 bison released at that time. And sometimes you'll do like at Wolacota, they initially created a pasture that was, I believe, 8,000 acres for the first 100. And then they created another fence that, as they grew, created access to, I believe, 20,000 acres, and then the full 27,680 the next year. So kind of taking that approach of like when a bison calves somewhere, that becomes like their traditional calving place and territory, and then it for the most part is home.
So you're
Sometimes
like
those,
using
yeah,
their natural biology to set their boundaries in a way by limiting the space they can get down to, like that first season or two,
yeah,
and then you eventually
yeah,
expand, but you know where they're going to come back to cat. That is such a brilliant move of then using their native biology to map their then or create their ecosystem. Like, I'm not surprised it's brilliant. Then it's like you've illustrated that you're just like a badass, right, out in the field and like with the snakes and the bison. It's so cool to hear about, right? That of like it might be something that for y'all at this stage it's just like anecdotal cool evidence, but it's like for me it's just mind-bogglingly exciting to hear that
yeah.
someone knows this and is doing this work and this is how it's being done. And it's I hope you know how inspirational it is as we were like
Oh, thanks.
hitting 2.5 hours discussing
Yeah,
this.
yeah, we should probably wrap up. And it's funny because like you I don't know. I'm probably like everyone else. You like your ego stroked a little bit when you said I was a badass, but I think full credit goes to the people who manage the bison on the ground. We just kind of bring the resources that they need, but yeah, it also just reminded me like you and I might have to talk some other time because I have also grabbed a mountain lion by the tail once. So um,
If that's
so
not a
I think
teaser for the next episode, I don't know what
yeah.
is.
Yeah. And I'm happy to send you a note about that. But yeah, that I think was a combination of youthful enthusiasm in terms of that I was really good at climbing trees when I was a kid. And so that I was excited to go up a tree with a mountain lion. It was also a bit of stupidity in terms of uh, wanting to do a really good job no matter what. But anyway, yeah, this work creates a lot of amazing opportunities with people and wildlife, and I'm grateful to people like you and your wife for being donors, and to everyone who's tuning in. And yeah, like I said, I think it's pretty amazing to be able to help make the things that we do happen on the ground. And it starts with people and community, and the wildlife that we can sustain in the places where they live. And yeah, it's pretty awesome to be able to do that.
It's awesome what you do, and to include us in this is just as much because it's you don't have to do this kind of outreach, but the fact that you get to do this and share these stories with us, I think will be life changing for a lot of people that maybe didn't look bison the same way, and now it's like there's this huge appreciation for it. Dennis, you spent for a 45-minute interview, we spent 2.5 hours with us. So thank you
Thank
for
you very much.
your time, but also your expertise, your passion, the stories that you shared with us today. It's been absolutely incredible, and I cannot thank you enough for taking your time out of your Saturday to spend your time with us at, on a Twitch stream of all places.
For sure. Well, and thanks for inspiring people. I think that's to me an amazing part is, like I said early on, that communication of what science can be and do, and that there's space for all of us to fuel our passions by following our hearts and our interests.
Absolutely. Is there a last message that you would like to give folks, whether or not about the difference that they can make from at home, about the bison, about anything at all? The floor is yours.
Yeah, I would say that World Wildlife Fund is doing wonderful work in this space. So you can always look us up. You can look me up, reach out, and I will try and get back to you if you do. And otherwise, organizations like Intertribal Buffalo Council, groups like Sichangako and Wola Lakota Buffalo Range. I think those tribal efforts, if anyone knows of tribal buffalo restoration efforts, I would suggest, by all means support them. If you go to the World Wildlife Fund website and specifically look up bison, some of those links to organizations that we work with and stories as well. If you just search World Wildlife Fund and bison, you're going to come across many, many articles that might offer ways to help. But of course, we're always grateful for support of our projects. But I think also just spreading the word. One thing we didn't talk about so much is just that I feel like, tribal people have a certain audience that they reach. And one of the privileges that we have through programs like this, through our own channels and everything, is that we can share those stories with a broader audience. We can share our platforms to share their stories uncensored, the way that they want to tell them and the way that they want their work portrayed, even though in this case I'm sharing the message today. And so I think just trying to be conduits for the world understanding what tribal people are trying to do and bringing bison back is really valuable, because I think, not to get political, but I think it can be really challenging, particularly with budget cuts and things like that. And I think that these efforts will be worthwhile no matter what. They're making a difference on so many fronts because bison were central and can be again. I'm just really glad to have spoken with you all, and thanks for your interest.
Dennis, thank you so much for everything that you do, not just, again, directly with the bison, but all the indirect work going on as well, including, like you said, I think the education we got today also about the importance of the bison to the native peoples is something that maybe most people don't know about. So it's not only we learned today about animals, but about history and culture, and it's just, that's why I consider you as a Renaissance man, and we're gonna save it at that, because it was truly incredible. And just, again, thank you for your time and how letting people know how they can support, and have a wonderful weekend and a happy Easter.
Everyone, all backgrounds, all ages, all genders, and all walks of life deserve an education. Come be one of us.